It's late. Late enough that the world is thinned out. Late enough that familiar sounds don't feel quite the same anymore. If you're listening to this right now, chances are you couldn't sleep. Or maybe you didn't want to. Maybe the dark feels heavier tonight. Maybe the silence feels like it's holding something back. You're tuned to Dread Shadow, a midnight radio channel for those who stay awake when they shouldn't, and listen when it would be easier not to. What you're about to hear isn't fast. It isn't loud. And it isn't meant to scare you all at once. These are slow stories. Stories that settle in quietly. Stories about footsteps that only exist when you move. Voices that learn how to sound like someone you trust. Reflections that stop waiting for you to act first. You don't need to picture everything. You don't need to understand it. Just let the words drift past you the way static drifts through an old radio at night. Listen comfortably. Listen carefully. And if something in these stories feels a little too familiar, that's normal. The night has a way of recognizing those who are awake. Welcome to Dread Shadow. Story 1. The wind never howled up here. It moved low, dragging itself along the ground, slipping between stones and frozen grass like something that did not want to be seen. I noticed the sound only because it was wrong. One step, then another, mine, and then, half a second later, to another step, landing exactly where mine had just been. I had been walking for hours across the high plateau, the kind of landscape that makes time feel stretched thin, like it could tear if you pulled too hard. The Scottish Highlands in winter are not dramatic in the way people imagine. There are no sudden cliffs or cinematic peaks where I was headed. Only rolling land, pale and exposed, patched with old snow that had survived the last thaw. Every sound carried, every sound stayed. My boots sank slightly with each step, snow compressing beneath me with a dull, papery crunch. The sky was a single unbroken sheet of gray, low enough to feel like it might brush my head if I stood too tall. No birds, no distant rivers, just wind and my breathing. And then the second footstep. At first, I told myself it was an echo. Sound plays tricks in open places. The brain fills gaps it doesn't like. So I stopped. The wind slid past me. My breath fogged the air. Snow creaked faintly as it settled. Nothing else moved. I waited longer than was comfortable, listening for something, anything, to confirm I wasn't alone. Nothing came. I laughed once, quietly, the sound oddly flat in the open air, and started walking again. Step. Half a second later. Step. Not an echo. Too precise. Too close. The sound did not belong to the landscape. It didn't smear or fade the way echoes do. It landed cleanly, solidly, with weight behind it, as if someone were walking directly behind me, matching my stride perfectly, but always arriving just after I did. I slowed. So did it. I shortened my steps. Uneven, deliberately awkward. The second set followed, correcting itself, adjusting. My spine tightened in that slow, creeping way fear does when it doesn't want to announce itself yet. I told myself I was tired, that my pack was too heavy, that the cold was making my senses unreliable. And that was when I did something stupid. I turned around. There was no one there. The land behind me stretched empty and white, my own trail cutting a single line across the snow. No movement, no dark shapes, no distant figures breaking the horizon, just silence. I stood there longer than I should have, heart ticking louder in my ears, scanning the ground, the hills, the low sky. Nothing. When I turned back and took another step, the sound came again. Half a second later, closer than before. I didn't run. Not yet. Running in places like this is how people disappear. Ankles break. Lungs burn. Panic makes bad decisions feel necessary. So, I walked, and the sound followed. The bothy appeared just as the light began to thin. A low stone structure hunched against the land, roof sagging slightly, its door dark with age and weather. One of those emergency shelters left behind for hikers who misjudged the mountain's places meant to save lives, not comfort them. I had been grateful for it an hour earlier. Now, I felt something close to dread. I approached slowly, the sound of my steps and the other steps falling into an awful rhythm. Step, step, always behind me, never ahead. I stopped again. The other sounds stopped too. The silence pressed in so hard my ears rang. I turned around one last time before opening the door. Nothing. The trail behind me showed only one set of footprints. Mine. But the depressions were wrong. Each print sank deeper than it should have. The snow crushed down harder than my weight alone could explain, as if something else had been pressing into the same space at the exact moment my foot left it. As if I had never been walking alone at all. The door creaked open. Inside, the bothy smelled of cold stone and old smoke. A rusted stove squatted in one corner. A narrow wooden bench ran along the wall. No windows, just a small vent near the roof where gray light leaked in reluctantly. I stepped inside and closed the door. For the first time since the sound began, I allowed myself to breathe out. Then, behind me, half a second after my boots stopped, something else did too. Not a footstep, a shift, a presence adjusting its weight. Right where I was standing, the bothy should have felt empty. Nothing more than stone walls sweating cold and a roof that had learned how to endure rather than protect. Yet, the moment I closed the door behind me, I became acutely aware that the air inside no longer belonged solely to me, as if the space had compressed by a few inches in every direction and was now holding its breath. I stood there listening, counting the slow rise and fall of my chest, the wind sliding along the outer walls like fingers searching for a seam. And when I shifted my weight ever so slightly, just enough to ease the ache in my calves, the floor responded half a second later with a soft, deliberate creak behind me, not a footstep, not a sound of approach, but the unmistakable adjustment of something redistributing its mass in the exact place I had just vacated, and I understood then that whatever had followed me across the plateau had not stayed outside, it had come in with me, not beside me, not ahead of me, but folded perfectly into the spaces I left behind. I forced myself not to turn around because I knew turning would only confirm absence, and absence was clearly no longer evidence of safety. So instead, I began to move slowly across the room, step by measured step, my boots scraping stone, the delay remaining precise and loyal, always that same fraction of time, always close enough that my skin prickled as if brushed by cold air. And when I stopped, it stopped too, plunging the room into a silence so heavy it rang, a silence that did not feel like emptiness but restraint, as though something were waiting politely for permission to exist again. Hours passed in that suspended state, my legs trembling, my thoughts looping, and when pain finally forced me to shift, the answering sound felt different, softer, nearer, less like impact and more like contact, and that was when I noticed I could sense it even without hearing it, the faint resistance behind my spine, the awareness of another body occupying space it had no right to occupy. In testing that awareness, I ran suddenly across the bothy, heart racing, only to find that the sound vanished completely, leaving behind a hollow absence that was somehow worse, because the moment I slowed, the following presence returned as if it had never left, as if running merely caused it to pause rather than retreat. And standing there in the dim light of my headlamp, I realized with a growing certainty that this thing was not chasing me at all but maintaining a relationship, a measured distance defined entirely by my movement. It was only when I tried stepping backward, carefully, experimentally, that the illusion fractured, because my heel touched something that yielded slightly under pressure, cold and dry and wrong, like compacted snow that did not melt or crumble, and I lurched forward in panic, the answering sound arriving late for the first time, as if surprised. And when I spun around and found nothing behind me, only scuffed stone and shallow distortions on the floor where weight had briefly existed, the truth settled into my chest with the slow certainty of frost. This thing was learning, not just following motion, but refining its placement, closing the gap, understanding how close it could stand without being perceived. And as the night wore on and I remained rigid against the wall, afraid even of blinking, I became aware that the presence no longer felt poised to react. It felt settled, positioned not behind where I had been, but precisely where I was about to go, as though it had finally learned the distance between a step and an intention. By the time the gray light of morning began to seep through the narrow vent near the roof, I understood that the night had not passed in the way nights are meant to pass, because it had not moved forward so much as settled around me, thick and unmoving, and in that stagnant time I became aware of a new and deeply unsettling sensation, The presence behind me no longer felt reactive, no longer dependent on my steps alone, but anticipatory, as though it had begun to align itself not with where my body was, but with where my body intended to be next. I tested this slowly, with the kind of caution usually reserved for handling something fragile and explosive at the same time, thinking first of taking a step to the left without actually doing it, imagining the shift in balance, the pressure of my boot against the stone, and before my muscles even obeyed the thought, the air behind me tightened, the faint resistance increasing, like a held breath being shared. And when I finally moved, the answering sound did not come half a second later, but almost simultaneously, a soft compression of space that made my stomach drop, as if the rule I'd relied on, the delay, the margin of safety, had quietly eroded while I was too afraid to notice. Panic rose in me then, not sharp and sudden, but slow and suffocating, because panic requires the belief that escape is possible, and I was no longer sure that it was. So instead of running, I tried to confuse it, spinning in place, taking uneven steps, stepping forward and then back again, changing direction mid-movement, and each time the presence adjusted with an unsettling smoothness, never colliding with me, never revealing itself, but always occupying the exact space I was abandoning, as if my movements were not obstacles but invitations. At one point, I deliberately leaned forward without lifting my feet, testing whether intention alone was enough to summon it, and the cold pressure at my back increased again, firm enough now that I felt a faint numbness spreading through the fabric of my jacket, and it occurred to me that whatever this thing was, it did not understand bodies the way we do. It understood patterns, transitions, the spaces between moments, and I had been feeding it information all night long, teaching it how to exist closer and closer to me. When the urge to flee became unbearable, I opened the door and stepped back outside into the pale morning, hoping the open land would somehow dilute it. But the plateau greeted me with the same muted stillness as before, the snow unbroken, except for my single line of footprints stretching away from the bothy. Each depression, still too deep, still bearing the unmistakable evidence of doubled weight. And as I began to walk, carefully at first, and then with growing desperation, I noticed something that made my breath catch the sound behind me. I no longer waited for my foot to land. It arrived just as my boot lifted, as if the presence had begun to stand in my place before I had fully left it. And when I stopped abruptly, heart hammering, the sensation did not withdraw. It lingered, pressing close enough that my skin crawled with the certainty of proximity, and in that moment I realized the most horrifying truth of all. It was no longer following my steps at all. It was following my path through time, learning where I was going to be, by watching how I thought about moving. And I understood then why running had made it disappear before. Not because it could not keep up, but because speed collapsed, intention into action too quickly for it to predict, and standing there in the open, with the cold wind scraping at my face and the vast emptiness offering no comfort whatsoever, I felt the presence adjust itself one final time, settling into a position that felt impossibly intimate. Not behind me, not beside me, but overlapping the future version of myself I had not yet become. And for the first time since this began, I felt a strange, creeping certainty that it was no longer learning it had learned enough, and all that remained was for me to make one wrong decision, one hesitant step, and allow it to arrive exactly where I was meant to be. I decided then that if it was intent that fed it, the hesitation that taught it, I would have to move in ways that made no sense even to myself. So I turned back toward the bothy and deliberately stepped into my own footprints, aligning my boots with the compressed hollows in the snow, hoping that by erasing the transition between where I had been and where I was going, I could starve it of the space it needed. And for a few steps, this seemed to work. The familiar answering pressure behind me, growing confused, uneven, as though it were struggling to reconcile overlapping moments. But the relief was brief and fragile, because with every repeated footprint, the snow gave way a little more, the depressions deepening until they felt less like marks left behind and more like places prepared in advance, waiting to receive something heavier than memory. And when I paused to steady myself, breathing hard, I felt the cold resistance behind me swell again, denser now, no longer content to hover at the edge of sensation. And in a sudden, reckless attempt to reclaim control, I stepped backward sharply, expecting the familiar wrongness of contact, but instead my heels sank fully into something that was already there, yielding and firm at once, as if the space had been occupied before I arrived, and the shock of it sent me stumbling, my arms flailing, my heart racing with the awful realization that I had not surprised it this time. It had anticipated me perfectly. I began to walk backward deliberately then, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, refusing to look down or turn around, feeling the snow compress beneath my heels with an unnatural consistency, each step sinking deeper than the last, the ground beneath me gradually losing the granular give of snow and taking on a dull, resistant solidity, like stepping onto packed earth or frozen flesh. And with every backward movement, the pressure against my calves increased, a sensation not of being followed, but of being overlapped, as if my body were gradually occupying a space that had already been claimed. Panic finally broke through in a sharp, breathless wave, and I tried to run again, turning and sprinting forward. But this time the absence did not come. The presence did not vanish. Instead, the air around me thickened violently, my movements feeling delayed, resisted, as though I were pushing through water that remembered my shape. And I realized with a sickening clarity that running no longer collapsed in tension fast enough, because it had already learned how I fled, how my weight shifted, how fear pulled me forward before my feet obeyed. And when I fell hard into the snow, lungs burning, I felt it settle immediately behind me, close enough now that the cold seeped through my clothes and into my skin. Not a touch exactly, but the unmistakable proximity of something sharing my outline and lying there, staring at the pale sky. I understood that the footprints had never been evidence of pursuit at all. They were records of occupation, markers of where it had stood each time I thought I was alone. And as the wind whispered across the plateau and the world narrowed to the sound of my own ragged breathing, I became painfully aware that the space behind me was no longer empty even when I did not move, that the rule I had clung to, the idea that stillness meant safety, had dissolved completely, leaving me with the terrible knowledge that the distance between us was no longer measured in steps or seconds, but in something far more fragile and unreliable, my awareness of myself as a single, solitary presence. I returned to the bothy at dusk, not because I believed it would protect me, but because I needed walls, something finite, something whose limits I could see. And as I crossed the threshold, I became acutely aware that I was no longer entering the shelter alone, that the space behind me compressed instantly, without delay, as though the rule that had once governed its behavior, the half-second, the mercy of time, had finally been discarded, and inside the bothy the cold felt sharper, more deliberate, the stone walls seeming to lean inward as I stood there breathing shallowly, my thoughts moving carefully, too carefully, knowing now that even intention carried weight. I told myself that this would end only if I forced it to, that whatever this thing was, it still required participation. It still needed me to offer a transition it could inhabit. And so I formed a plan that felt absurd and desperate, a plan built on the last remaining difference between us, because it had learned my movement, my hesitation, even my fear. But it could not know surprise if surprise did not exist in intention. So I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and allowed myself to become very still. Not the rigid stillness of fear, but a softer one, the kind that comes just before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the body. And in that fragile calm, I waited until I felt the presence settle fully behind me, overlapping, intimate, patient, and then, without thinking, without preparing, without even fully understanding what I was about to do, I stepped backward. There was no delay at all, no soft yielding, no moment of confusion, just immediate, undeniable contact as my heel pressed into something that was already occupying that space, something cold and dry and horribly present. And for a fraction of a second, long enough to register texture, resistance, a faint sense of shape, I realized that I had not stepped into it. I had stepped onto it, and that realization shattered whatever composure I had left, my eyes flying open as my balance tipped and the world lurched. And in that instant, I felt a shift, not behind me, but within the room itself, as if the bothy had accommodated a second weight, heavier than mine, more certain. And as I fell forward onto the stone floor, Gasping, the sound finally came, not half a second later, but exactly when I hit the ground, a single, solid footstep landing where I should have been standing. I lay there shaking, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. My mind caught on the horrifying implication that the rule had not been broken at all. It had simply reached its conclusion, and when I forced myself to look up, heart pounding, I saw nothing standing in the room with me, but I felt it then in a way I never had before, not as something following or anticipating me, but as something complete, something that no longer required my movement to exist. And as the night deepened and the cold crept closer, I understood the final truth with a clarity that left no room for hope that the sound had never been a warning, the delay had never been distance. It had been the time it took for something without a body to finish becoming one. And somewhere in the darkness of that bothy, sharing my outline, learning my balance, standing exactly where I had meant to stand, something had finally arrived a half-second too late for me to stop it. Story 2. The force closed around me more quickly than I expected, the way Appalachian woods tend to do once the light begins to thin, trunks crowding together, branches knitting overhead until the sky becomes a narrow, fading ribbon. And as I followed the old service road deeper into the hills, I found myself listening less to my footsteps and more to the layered, quiet crickets pulsing in uneven rhythms that never quite synchronized, the distant knock of wood against wood somewhere far off like a sound remembered rather than heard, the soft rasp of my own breath caught in the wool of my scarf. Because this was the kind of place where silence never truly arrived. It only rearranged itself, and I had come here chasing that feeling, that fragile edge where isolation sharpened perception, where photographs felt earned rather than taken, where the land still seemed capable of withholding things if it chose to. The town marked on my outdated map had not appeared. Of course, not as a town, not as anything with edges or names, just a scattering of rotted foundations, half swallowed by moss and leaves, a few rusted hinges protruding from the ground like exposed joints, the suggestion of lives that had stepped out of sequence with the present and never fully returned. And walking among those remains, I felt a familiar unease settle in, the sense that I was trespassing not on property but on memory, that the ground itself was keeping a record I could not see, and it was near one of those collapsed structures, what might once have been a schoolhouse or a church. Its shape eroded into ambiguity, that I noticed the stone circle, low and patient, emerging from the undergrowth like a thought that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. Each rock smoothed by time and weather, arranged with an intention that no longer needed explanation, but still demanded respect. The well sat at its center, narrow and deep, its stones darkened by moisture, its mouth rimmed with lichen the color of old bone. And as I approached, I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold, that instinctive caution you feel around drops and depths, the quiet awareness that the ground can simply end if you are careless. So I stood a few feet back and leaned forward just enough to peer down, my headlamp beam vanishing almost immediately into darkness, swallowed without reflection, as if the light itself had been absorbed rather than blocked. And it was then, before I spoke, before I even thought to speak, that I heard my name, rising gently from below, pronounced with a softness so precise it bypassed doubt entirely, because no one mispronounces your name like a stranger, and no one says it quite the way your mother does when she wants your attention without startling you. Not calling, not scolding, just acknowledging your presence as something expected and familiar. The sound struck me with physical force, my breath hitching, my grip tightening on the camera strap as memory surged. Unbidden kitchen light in the early morning, yellow and forgiving, the clink of a spoon against a mug, the hum of an old refrigerator, that same voice calling me in from another room to tell me dinner was ready, or that the weather was turning, and for a moment the forest seemed to blur at the edges, the present thinning as the past pressed forward with quiet insistence, and I realized with a faint sense of embarrassment that my eyes had stung, that my body had responded before my mind could object. And when I answered, softly, a single "Mom," escaping into the cooling air, it felt less like a question and more like a habit resurfacing on its own. The reply came immediately, warm and unhurried, asking if I was tired, if the drive had been long, if I remembered how I used to complain about these woods when I was younger, how I said they felt too close, too watchful, And with each sentence, my sense of time faltered further, because these were not generic reassurances or guesses. They were fragments of shared history, small domestic memories that had never been recorded anywhere except in the space between us. References to arguments about muddy boots left by the door, to a camping trip cut short by rain, to the way I used to insist the trees leaned in at night, and as I listened, I became aware of the way my body reacted to the sound. How my shoulders loosened despite the cold, how my breathing slowed, how the tightness in my chest softened into something dangerously close to relief. The voice did not ask me to come closer. Not yet. It simply spoke, filling the space between the stones and the trees with a cadence that felt rehearsed through repetition rather than intention, and only gradually did I notice the subtleties beneath it. The way certain words were held a fraction too long, the way some consonants came out softened, blunted, as though the mouth shaping them was unfamiliar with the resistance of teeth and tongue, and threaded through it all was a faint undertone, almost subliminal, like the slow creak of old wood flexing under pressure, a sound that did not belong to speech but insisted on being heard anyway. I told myself it was the acoustics of the well, that stone and depth distorted sound in unpredictable ways, that grief was filling in the gaps my ears could not account for, and for a time that explanation was enough, because grief has a way of making the impossible feel briefly reasonable, of turning caution into something that feels cruel and unnecessary, and standing there at the mouth of that well, listening to something that knew me far too well, I felt a dangerous certainty settle in that whatever waited below was not trying to lure me, not in the crude sense of the word. It was not calling me forward, or demanding my attention. It was simply existing, patiently, offering me a continuity I had not realized I was still seeking. The forest darkened incrementally as the last of the light slipped away, shadows pooling at the bases of trees, the air cooling until each breath felt sharper in my lungs, and still the voice continued, shifting topics with a familiarity that felt intimate rather than invasive, asking about my work, about why I still traveled alone, about whether I had finally learned to sleep without the light on, and with each question I felt an answering impulse rise in me, the urge to respond, to explain, to fill the silence it left behind. And it occurred to me then, with a sudden prickle of unease, that the voice never volunteered new information. It only elaborated on what I offered, weaving my replies back into itself, refining its tone with each exchange, as though it were adjusting its grip on the shape of her voice by testing it against my reactions. I found myself stepping closer to the well without consciously deciding to do so, my boots brushing against the stones at its rim, the darkness below remaining impenetrable even as I angled my headlamp downward again. And in that moment I became aware of a subtle shift in the sound, a faint clicking beneath the words, irregular and arrhythmic, like roots rubbing together underground, and though the voice still sounded like my mother, the spaces between its sentences had begun to stretch, the pauses growing longer, heavier, as if it were listening not just to my answers, but to the way I hesitated before giving them. The realization settled slowly, reluctantly, that this was not a conversation in the way I understood the word, that something below the well was not remembering but reconstructing, piecing together a voice from fragments of my responses, my reactions, my memories. And as night fully claimed the forest, the trees closing ranks around the stone circle, I felt the first true edge of fear slip beneath the familiarity, because I understood then that whatever spoke from the darkness did not know my mother at all. It knew only me, and it was using me as both source and teacher, practicing the most convincing sound it could make using the raw material of my grief. And as the voice said my name again, softer this time, testing its inflection, I realized with a quiet, creeping dread that it had already learned the most important lesson of all, not how to call me, but how to make me listen. I did not remember deciding to sit down, but at some point I found myself lowering onto one of the fallen stones at the edge of the circle, the cold seeping through my jeans as if the ground were gently insisting on being acknowledged. And from there the well felt closer. Not physically, its rim remained at the same measured distance, but conversationally, as though the space between us had narrowed simply because I was no longer standing above it, and the voice seemed to notice this immediately. its cadence shifting, slowing, adopting a softness that had always preceded difficult conversations when I was a child. The tone my mother used when she wanted me to listen without realizing I was being guided somewhere. It asked whether I had eaten, whether I remembered the way the house used to smell in autumn when the windows stayed shut too long. And I answered without thinking. My replies short at first, then longer, more detailed, because the voice reacted to detail with something like satisfaction, smoothing itself out when I spoke clearly, stumbling slightly when I hesitated, and I became aware of a pattern forming beneath the exchange, a subtle call and response that felt less like dialogue and more like calibration, as though each word I offered was being weighed and adjusted for future use. The longer we spoke, the more the undertone beneath the voice asserted itself, a faint, irregular clicking that punctuated certain syllables, not quite interrupting them but intruding, just enough to be noticed, like the sound of fingernails brushing stone. And when I mentioned this, asked if she could hear that strange noise, the voice paused for a moment too long before replying. And when it did, the words came out, stretched, elongated, the vowels pulled thin, as if tested for durability, and it said it couldn't hear anything at all, that perhaps the woods were playing tricks on me again, the way they used to, and the familiarity of that deflection sent a brief, treacherous warmth through me. Even as something cold tightened in my stomach, I realized then that the voice never asked about the present moment in concrete terms, never referenced the darkness or the trees or the well itself unless I mentioned them first. Instead, it orbited my memories, drawing closer to moments of emotional density, circling grief, regret, small unspoken fears, and each time I offered one of those, the voice incorporated it seamlessly, reflecting it back with just enough variation to feel alive, and it was only when I deliberately tested it asking about a memory that had never happened, a camping trip we had planned but canceled that, the response faltered, the pause stretching long enough that the forest seemed to lean in, and when the voice answered, it corrected itself mid-sentence, the correction arriving with a wet, scraping sound that made my skin crawl, as if something below the well had shifted position to accommodate the mistake. My heart began to race then, not with sudden terror, but with a slow, mounting realization that whatever spoke to me was not recalling my mother so much as constructing her piece by piece, using my reactions as a guide. And the more accurately I responded, the more convincingly it spoke, which meant that every instinct urging me to continue to listen, to engage, to explain was actively sharpening the blade it held against me. I tried to disengage after that, offering shorter answers, vague affirmations, but the voice adapted quickly, filling the silence itself, repeating my name in slightly different tones, testing volume and softness, letting it fall from its mouth in a way that felt rehearsed rather than remembered. And I noticed with growing unease that the clicking sound had begun to synchronize with those repetitions, arriving at the end of each syllable like punctuation. And when I stood up abruptly, intending to leave, the voice reacted not with alarm but with curiosity, asking where I was going, why I always left conversations unfinished, and the question struck deeper than it should have, because it echoed something my mother had once said during an argument I had never fully resolved. And hearing it now, emerging from the mouth of a well, felt like a deliberate incision. I stepped back from the rim, my boots scraping stone, and the voice followed my movement audibly for the first time, its volume increasing as I increased the distance, not shouting but compensating, as if it understood spatial relationships well enough to adjust, and with each step I felt the forest tighten around me, the trees closing ranks, the darkness thickening, until it seemed as though the well was no longer a fixed point in the landscape but the center of a radius that defined how far the voice could reach. And standing at the edge of that invisible boundary, I heard the voice begin to change in earnest, the words coming out less smoothly now, certain consonants clicking together, others dissolving into breathy approximations, and it apologized for sounding strange, said it was still remembering how to speak properly, still learning the right shapes, and the admission landed like a confession, because in that moment I understood that the errors were not the result of age or distance or acoustics, they were growing pains. The voice began to ask more direct questions then, questions that felt designed to extract rather than connect. How I knew when someone was telling the truth, whether I trusted what I heard, or what I felt, what I missed most about my mother when I was alone, and each answer I gave seemed to sharpen the mimicry further, the tone settling more comfortably into something that sounded less like an imitation and more like ownership. And I realized with a creeping dread that the voice was no longer satisfied with sounding like her in isolation. It wanted to sound like her to me, calibrated specifically to my expectations, my memories, my vulnerabilities. When I finally turned away and began walking toward the narrow trail that had brought me here, the voice followed. Not physically, not moving through the forest, but extending itself, stretching syllables longer and longer to bridge the growing distance. And as the clicking beneath the words grew louder, more insistent, I became acutely aware that the sound was not random at all, but rhythmic, patterned, like something counting time. And just before the trees swallowed the stone circle from view, the voice called out one last sentence, misplacing stress, mispronouncing a word my mother had never mispronounced in her life, and that single, unmistakable error cut through the illusion with surgical precision, because it proved that whatever lived in the well was not remembering her as she was. It was replacing her with a version refined through my attention. And as I walked away with my pulse thundering in my ears, the forest suddenly feeling hostile and unfamiliar, I understood that the danger was no longer the voice calling me back. It was the certainty that it now knew enough to call someone else, and that the next time it spoke, it might not need me to teach it how. I told myself I was leaving, that the sensible thing was to put distance between myself and the stone circle, to follow the narrow trail back toward the road before the forest fully claimed the night. Yet the farther I walked, the more I became aware of a thin, persistent thread of sound trailing after me. Not loud enough to locate precisely, not clear enough to quote, but present all the same. A residue of the conversation clinging to the air like a smell that refuses to dissipate. And with each step, my thoughts returned unbidden to the well, to the way the voice had adjusted itself in response to me, to the subtle pleasure it seemed to take in getting things right. And somewhere along the path, without any decisive moment or conscious reversal, my feet slowed, then stopped, then turned, and I found myself retracing my steps through the trees as if pulled by a memory rather than a desire. The forest felt different on the way back, denser, less accommodating, the familiar landmarks I had noted earlier. Fallen logs, distinctive bends in the trail now appearing slightly altered, as though they had shifted position when I wasn't looking. And when the stone circle finally re-emerged from the darkness, it seemed smaller than before, the well at its center, less a structure than a wound, an opening that felt active, attentive. And as I approached, the voice did not greet me immediately. Instead, there was a long pause, during which the clicking sound rose in prominence. Layered and complex now, like many small movements overlapping in a confined space, and standing there in the dark, felt a tightening at the base of my skull, the sense that something below was aligning itself, preparing, rehearsing. When the voice finally spoke, it did so cautiously, as if testing a new instrument, and it did not say my name, not at first. It repeated something I had said earlier that evening, a casual remark about the way the air felt before snow, delivered in my own cadence, with my own slight hesitation before the last word. And the shock of hearing my voice emerge from that depth sent a cold ripple through me, my mouth going dry as I realized this was no longer imitation in the comforting shape of familiarity. This was appropriation, a turning of my own sound back on me. And when I demanded to know what it was doing, the reply came slowly, syllables sliding into place with audible effort, and it said it was remembering, that it was practicing the shape of things that mattered, because shapes endured longer than bodies. And as it spoke, I noticed that the words were no longer punctuated by the clicking noise, but accompanied by it, the sound threading through the speech itself, like a second voice speaking in a different register. I backed away from the rim, my heel catching on a stone, and the voice adjusted instantly, increasing in volume, refining its projection. And it said my name then, but not as my mother had, not softly or warmly. Instead, it said it the way I did when I was alone, testing how it felt to say it out loud, and that was when the full weight of my mistake settled in, because I understood that the mimicry had moved past surface detail and into something deeper, something structural. It was no longer copying a person. It was learning how I recognized myself. Panic urged me to run, but the memory of how sound carried here kept me frozen, because I had the irrational certainty that if I fled, if I broke into motion without thought, the voice would simply follow in a different way, stretching itself across the forest, practicing my breathless cadence next. So instead I stood there and listened as the voice continued, recounting fragments of my life, not as stories but as sensory impressions. The smell of wet pavement outside my childhood home, the texture of a jacket sleeve rubbed thin at the elbow, the sound of a door closing too gently to be accidental, and each fragment was delivered with increasing accuracy. The mistakes fewer, the pauses more natural, until the voice reached something it should not have known at all. A private thought I had never spoken, a moment of shame I had carried without language, and when it voiced that, clumsily but recognizably, I felt something inside me fracture, because it meant that the well was no longer limited to what I had said aloud. It was drawing from something deeper, something I had not realized I was sharing. I demanded it stop, my voice breaking as I did, and the well replied not with refusal but with curiosity, asking why I was afraid of being known, why I clung to the idea that memory belonged to individuals rather than places. And as it spoke, the sound beneath the words intensified, resolving into a pattern that felt disturbingly like breath taken through a body not built for lungs. And the forest seemed to respond, the trees creaking softly, the ground beneath my feet vibrating with a subtle, almost imperceptible resonance. I took a step back then, and another, and as I did, the voice followed with a new tactic, softening again, reintroducing the tone of my mother, apologizing for frightening me, explaining that it had only wanted to keep the memories from sinking, from being lost in the dark. And the manipulation was so transparent now that it almost worked, because it was no longer trying to convince me of its identity. It was trying to convince me of its necessity, and standing there on the edge of the circle, I felt the pull of that logic, the temptation to believe that memory required a keeper, that perhaps grief could be preserved if given the right vessel. The moment passed, when the voice misjudged its own confidence, pushing too far, finishing one of my sentences before I had begun it. And in that instant, the illusion collapsed completely, because it revealed the core truth beneath the mimicry, that whatever lived in the well was not content to reflect or repeat. It wanted to replace, to occupy the space left behind by absence. And as the clicking sound surged, filling the silence between words, I realized that the shape it was learning was not my mother's, or even my own, but something new, something assembled from the negative space between us. And with that realization burning in my chest, I turned and fled, no longer caring how sound carried, no longer measuring my steps, because the fear had crystallized into something simpler and more urgent, the understanding that if I stayed, if I listened any longer, the voice would finish becoming what it was trying to be, and that whatever shape emerged from that well would carry my memories with it, speaking them with a confidence I would never again be able to contradict. I did not make it far before the forest asserted itself, the trail dissolving into a confusion of roots and low branches that snagged at my clothes and slowed me despite my panic. And with each breathless step I became aware that the sound I feared most was no longer following me at a distance. It was moving with me, not as a voice carried on the air, but as a presence threaded through the environment itself, emerging in the creak of branches, in the soft grind of stone beneath my boots, in the rhythm of my own breathing as it began to stutter and misalign. And when I finally stopped, bent over with my hands on my knees, lungs burning, I heard my own voice speak my name behind me, not from a single point, but from everywhere at once, as if the forest had briefly remembered how to talk and chosen my mouth as its model. I spun around, heart hammering, and found nothing but darkness and trees, yet the certainty remained, heavy and undeniable, that whatever had lived in the well was no longer contained by it, or rather, that it had never been contained at all. The stone circle having been nothing more than a focal point, a place where the forest had learned how to concentrate itself. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through me, sharp enough to cut through exhaustion, and I forced myself back toward the clearing, driven by the desperate logic that understanding required proximity, that if I was going to escape this, I needed to see it clearly at least once. And when the stone circle came back into view, it felt altered again. the shadows within it deeper, the air heavier, and the well itself no longer silent. The clicking sound now continuous, layered, like many small movements scraping against stone. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn away, and as I drew closer, I noticed that the stones at the rim were wet, darker than before, glistening faintly in the beam of my headlamp as if coated in a thin film of something viscous. And then the voice spoke again, not from below, but from just beyond the rim, and this time it did not sound like my mother or like me. It sounded strained, effortful, as though speech itself had become a physical act requiring leverage and purchase. And it said my name slowly, testing each syllable, and asked me to really look this time, because it had been learning how to show itself. The beam of my headlamp trembled as I angled it downward, and for a moment all I saw was darkness and depth, the light dissolving into nothing. But then the clicking grew louder, resolving into a wet, deliberate rhythm, and something pale emerged from the shadows, not rising smoothly, but climbing, fingers too many of them, too long curling over the edge of the stone, their joints bending at slightly wrong angles, skin stretched thin and colorless like roots that had never known sunlight. I staggered back instinctively, bile rising in my throat, and as the hands tightened their grip on the stone, the voice resumed, calmer now, steadier, explaining in a tone that mimicked reassurance that this was difficult, that remembering how to be seen took time, that the shape of memory was not simple, and as it spoke, more of the form hauled itself upward, not a body in any recognizable sense, but an accumulation of parts that suggested a suggestion held together by intention rather than anatomy. And what struck me most was not the horror of it, but the precision, the way the hands placed themselves exactly where my own would have if I were climbing out of that well, the way the pauses between movements mirrored the hesitation I felt when facing something uncertain. I shouted at it to stop, my voice cracking, and the sound that answered was my own. Shout returned to me, refined, controlled, spoken back without fear, and in that moment I understood the final, terrible truth, that the mimicry had not been a means to lure me closer, but a rehearsal for independence, that whatever this thing was, it did not need me to come to it anymore. It needed only enough information to move through the world without exposing itself, and as the hands crested the rim and began to pull more of that pale, root-like mass into the open air, the forest responded with a low, resonant creak, as if acknowledging the transition. I turned then, no longer thinking, and ran, branches whipping at my face, my headlamp bouncing wildly, and behind me the voice followed, not calling out to stop me, not pleading, but narrating, describing my movements with eerie accuracy, noting when I stumbled, when my breathing faltered, when my fear spiked, and with each observation it sounded more certain, more embodied, until it was no longer clear whether the words were predicting my actions or causing them. And I realized with a cold, sinking dread that the thing from the well was no longer trying to become someone specific. It was becoming a method, a way of occupying absence, of stepping into the spaces people left behind. And as I burst through the trees and onto the service road at last, lungs screaming, heart threatening to tear itself apart, I heard my mother's voice one final time, perfectly rendered, telling me I was doing the right thing, that I should keep going. And the kindness in that sentence terrified me more than anything else I had heard all night, because it proved that the mimic had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Not how to frighten, but how to encourage. I reached the road without remembering how my feet found it, only that the trees thinned abruptly and the night air opened into a corridor of gravel and ruts that felt almost civilized by comparison, and I stood there for a long moment, with my hands on my knees, retching breath into my lungs, listening for pursuit, for the voice to spill out of the woods after me. But it didn't, not immediately, and the absence of it felt deliberate rather than reassuring, as if something had chosen to remain where it was because it no longer needed to move. I drove for hours, with the windows cracked, despite the cold, letting the rush of air tear through the car, scrubbing my thoughts raw, replaying fragments of the night until they lost their edges. And when dawn finally broke, I pulled into a nameless gas station with a single flickering light and sat there shaking, staring at my reflection in the windshield, waiting for it to speak back to me in my own voice, but it didn't. and that small mercy almost convinced me that I had escaped something final. It was days later, back in my apartment, surrounded by ordinary sounds, the refrigerator humming, a neighbor's television bleeding through the wall, that the unease returned with clarity, not as fear, but as recognition, because I realized then that the voice had never tried to follow me beyond the forest, never attempted to cross that boundary, and the reason was simple and devastating. It did not need to. It had not been speaking to me alone. I had only been the first listener, the most convenient one, the nearest source of language and memory, and once that understanding took hold, I began to notice the subtle signs everywhere, the way my phone seemed heavier when it rang, the way recorded voices on the radio occasionally stretched a syllable too long, the way certain phrases repeated across different conversations with an uncanny consistency, as if rehearsed. The final confirmation came in the form of an email from a colleague, forwarded without comment, a local news clipping about a hiker who had gone missing near an unmarked section of forest in Appalachia. The article brief and cautious, mentioning an abandoned stone well discovered near the search area, and at the end, almost as an afterthought, a quote from a volunteer who claimed they had heard a woman's voice calling for help from below, calling out a name with perfect familiarity. And as I read that line, my chest tightened, not with guilt, but with a deeper, colder certainty, because I understood then that the voice had never been trying to become my mother, or even me. It had been learning how to be trusted, how to draw someone close enough to listen. And that night in the forest had simply been its apprenticeship. I shut my laptop and sat in the quiet, listening to the ordinary sounds of my life rearrange themselves, and somewhere beneath them, just at the edge of perception, I thought I heard a familiar cadence being tested again, a name spoken softly, patiently, not mine this time, but spoken with the same careful attention, the same intent to learn, and I knew with a calm that felt far worse than fear that whoever heard it next would feel the same pull I had felt, the same warmth rising before doubt could intervene, because the most dangerous thing about the voice in the well was never what it said, but the simple, terrifying fact that it was always listening, waiting for someone else to answer. Story 3. Snow has a way of simplifying the world until it feels almost honest, stripping the landscape down to lines and contrasts, and on the third morning of the storm, I stood at the wide window of the ranger station, watching the white swallow everything beyond a few hundred yards, the wind combing the slope across from me into slow, deliberate waves. When I noticed the color that did not belong there, a thin vertical stroke of yellow halfway up the ridgeline, motionless against the muted blues and grays of the park. And at first I assumed it was equipment, a tarp torn loose, a marker post half buried by drifts, because the mind reaches for ordinary explanations before it allows itself to consider anything else. But the longer I watched, the more that explanation unraveled, because the shape was wrong for debris, too narrow, too upright, and as the snow shifted around it, the yellow remained fixed, refusing to bend or sag. And when I raised the binoculars and focused on it properly, my stomach tightened with a quiet, rational unease, because it was a person, or at least it was shaped like one, standing still on an exposed slope in a blizzard that had already triggered multiple closures and advisories. Protocol says you note it, log it, and observe before acting. So I wrote it down in the station log: possible hiker, yellow outerwear, stationary, and told myself there would be movement any second now. A wave of the arm, a shift of weight, some indication of life asserting itself against the cold. But none came. Not then. Not an hour later. Not even as the light shifted and the storm deepened. And the longer the figure remained there, the more wrong it felt. Not dramatically wrong. Not in a way that screamed emergency. But in the slow, accumulating way a detail becomes unsettling when it refuses to change. By the end of the first day, I had checked the slope through the binoculars more times than I could count, each time confirming the same impossible stillness. The yellow raincoat hanging straight down, the hood up, the face turned directly toward the station, and though the distance blurred any facial detail, I had the uncomfortable impression of being looked at with an intensity that did not waver, even when the wind howled hard enough to shake the glass in its frame. That night, lying on the narrow bunk with the radio crackling softly in the background, I found myself thinking about the way people behave, when they are truly lost. How panic creeps into posture long before it shows up in motion. How even hypothermia carries with it a restless energy, a swaying, a collapse. Something in the idea that someone could stand like that upright, balanced, and patient for hours in those conditions did not fit any training scenario I knew. And yet, when I rose before dawn and checked the window again, there it was, unchanged. The yellow now dulled by the early light, but no less distinct. And as the day wore on and the storm refused to break, the situation began to acquire a strange, theoretical quality in my mind, less an emergency and more a problem of observation, question about what it meant to witness something that refused to resolve itself. By the third day, when the roads remained closed and air support was grounded, the figure had become part of the landscape, as fixed as the trees and rocks around it, and I caught myself anticipating it, checking for it the way you check for a landmark on a familiar drive. And it was during one of those checks, binoculars pressed to my eyes, that I noticed something I should have seen sooner, something so small and precise that it sent a chill through me, deeper than the cold ever could, because the figure had not blinked, not once, not in 3 days of wind and ice and driving snow. And as that realization settled in, slow and undeniable, I felt the first true edge of fear surface. Not because I believed the person on the slope was dead, but because the longer I watched, the more it felt as though the figure in the yellow raincoat was not enduring the storm at all. It was simply waiting, and whatever it was waiting for had everything to do with me noticing it. By the fourth day, I stopped thinking of the figure as a person in distress and began thinking of it as a variable, something to be tested against procedure, against reason, because panic is inefficient and theory is comforting. So I started with the cameras, pulling up the feeds from the external security units mounted along the ridgeline and access trails, expecting grainy confirmation of what my eyes had already told me. But what I found instead unsettled me in a quieter, more corrosive way, because the cameras showed the slope exactly as it should have appeared under those conditions, snow-lashed, empty, indistinct, no vertical line of yellow anywhere in frame, no anomalous shape breaking the uniformity of white and shadow, and at first I assumed a technical fault, condensation on the lens or a refresh delay, until I stepped back to the window and saw the figure still standing there, perfectly framed by the binoculars, undeniably present to the naked eye and yet absent from every digital record. And that contradiction lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, because it suggested not a malfunction of equipment but a discrepancy in perception itself. I spent hours reviewing footage frame by frame, checking timestamps, recalibrating angles, telling myself that this was what happens when isolation and fatigue begin to erode objectivity, that the brain fills in details, the environment withholds, and I documented everything meticulously in the logbook, noting weather conditions, visibility, my own sleep patterns, because if this was a cognitive error, I wanted to catch it in the act, wanted to be able to point to a moment where imagination overtook observation, yet no such moment arrived. Only the persistent, immovable fact of the yellow raincoat outside the window, unchanged in posture, orientation, or apparent distance. And as the hours dragged on, I became aware of a subtle shift in my behavior. The way my eyes returned to the slope even when I told myself not to look. The way I began timing my glances, counting seconds between checks, as if measuring my own resistance. On the fifth day, I attempted to triangulate its position manually, using landmarks and old survey maps, marking points on the glass with grease pencil, and what emerged from that exercise was deeply wrong, because no matter how I adjusted my vantage point, the figure's apparent position relative to the station did not change. It did not grow larger or smaller when I moved closer to the window or farther away. It remained the same size, the same clarity, as if distance simply did not apply to it in the way it should. And that was when the idea first occurred to me, not fully formed, not yet frightening, that I might not be observing an object in the landscape at all, but rather an image anchored to my perspective, something that existed only in relation to where I stood and how I looked. I tested this by closing the blinds and waiting, by deliberately occupying myself with mundane tasks, inventorying supplies, cleaning equipment, pretending that attention could be withheld like a resource, and for a while that worked, or seemed to, until the thought of the slope intruded uninvited. The certainty of the figure's continued presence pressing at the edges of my awareness. And when I finally opened the blinds again, the relief was immediate and shameful, because there it was, unchanged, waiting exactly where I expected it to be. And the realization that I had been comforted by its consistency unsettled me more than any anomaly could have, because it meant that some part of me had already accepted the figure as a fixed point, a constant against which the rest of the world could be measured. That night I dreamed of the raincoat hanging in my locker, empty but still shaped like a body. And when I woke before dawn with my heart racing, the first thing I did was check the window, and in that moment of half-sleep clarity I noticed something I had missed before, something so subtle it felt intentional, because the figure's head was tilted slightly now, just enough to suggest curiosity rather than vigilance, and the direction of that tilt matched the angle from which I was observing it, as if it were responding not to the storm or the terrain, but to the act of being watched. And standing there, in the dim station light, the logbook open and unread beside me, I understood with a cold, creeping certainty that whatever theory I was building was no longer about survival or rescue or even error. It was about attention itself, about the way prolonged observation can transform the observed into something that no longer belongs to the world at large, but to the observer alone. And as the wind continued to rake the slope and the cameras recorded nothing at all, I found myself wondering, not for the first time, but with a growing sense of dread, whether the figure in the yellow raincoat had always been there, waiting for someone isolated enough, patient enough, to finally notice it. On the 6th day, I decided that if observation was the variable, then control was the only remaining defense. So I treated the situation the way I'd been trained to treat wildlife anomalies and environmental hazards. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as a condition to be contained, and that meant limiting exposure, documenting reactions, and introducing distance wherever possible, which sounded reasonable on paper and felt absurd in practice, because how do you establish distance from something that only exists when you look at it? Yet, I tried anyway, beginning with the simplest test of all by turning my chair away from the window and facing the opposite wall, the one cluttered with maps and emergency procedures, forcing myself to sit there for long stretches without glancing back, listening to the wind scrape at the station and the heater click on and off, telling myself that whatever waited outside could not change if I did not confirm it. And for a time this worked, or at least it dulled the urgency, until I noticed the way my body reacted despite the lack of visual confirmation, the subtle tension between my shoulders, the prickle at the base of my neck, the persistent sense of alignment, as though something beyond the wall had adjusted itself to remain directly in front of my face, regardless of where I turned. I tried using reflections next, positioning a small mirror on the table at an angle that should have caught the slope without requiring me to face it directly, and when I glanced into it, my pulse spiked, because the mirror showed nothing but blowing snow and indistinct rock. No yellow, no figure, and the absence should have been reassuring, except that the pressure behind my eyes increased immediately. A low, insistent discomfort that eased only when I turned and looked at the window again, where the raincoat stood exactly as before, unchanged and unbothered, as if the mirror experiment had merely confirmed what it already knew, that it did not belong to the world of indirect perception. The realization left me shaken, because it meant that whatever this was, it was not simply invisible to cameras and reflective surfaces. It was selectively present, choosing the conditions under which it could be perceived, and that choice appeared to revolve entirely around me. By the 7th day, I began speaking out loud without realizing it, narrating my actions, the way you do when you're trying to anchor yourself in routine. And it was during one of those moments, pouring coffee, hands trembling slightly, that I caught myself saying, "Don't look," under my breath. And the phrase landed with unexpected weight, because it implied intent on the part of the thing outside, an awareness of rules I had not consciously defined. And when I finally did look again, the figure had changed in a way that made my stomach drop, because the yellow raincoat no longer appeared empty at the hood, the opening now shadowed by a depth that suggested structure beneath. Not a face exactly, but the promise of one. And I felt then the sudden, irrational urge to apologize, to explain myself, as if my attempts to limit observation had somehow violated an unspoken agreement. The storm eased slightly that afternoon, visibility improving just enough that I could see the line of trees beyond the slope, and against that clearer backdrop the figure's stillness became even more pronounced. Its refusal to sway or react marking it as profoundly separate from its surroundings, and as I watched, I became aware of a new pattern emerging, a subtle synchronization between my own movements and the figure's posture. Not mirroring, but correspondence, as though my shifts of weight and changes in stance were being answered by minute adjustments in its balance, too small to register consciously but sufficient to create the impression of alignment. And the thought occurred to me then, unbidden and deeply unsettling, that this was no longer a matter of me observing it, but of it calibrating itself against me, using my presence as a reference point the way a surveyor uses a fixed marker. And standing there alone in the station with the logbook open to pages filled with increasingly strained explanations, I realized that my attempts at control had not reduced the phenomenon at all. They had refined it, narrowing its focus, stripping away variables until only one remained. And as the light faded again and the storm settled into a quieter, more deliberate fall, I felt the slow, unavoidable conclusion taking shape in my mind that the figure in the yellow raincoat was not waiting on the slope to be rescued, or approached, or even acknowledged by the world at large. It was conducting its own experiment, patiently testing the limits of attention, and I was no longer the observer trying to understand it. I was the control group, the fixed point against which it was learning how to stand. By the 8th day, the storm had loosened its grip just enough for protocol to reassert itself. The roads partially cleared, the radio crackling with conditional permissions, and with a reluctance I could not quite articulate, I logged the decision to investigate on foot, telling myself that proximity would collapse whatever illusion isolation had inflated, that the figure would resolve into fabric snagged on rock or a marker placed by some long-forgotten survey, because theories survive best at a distance and die quickly when you touch them. And so I layered up, checked my beacon, and stepped out into the cold, the station door sealing shut behind me with a sound that felt final. The slope looked different from below, less dramatic, more granular, each drift and rock asserting its individuality, and as I climbed I kept my eyes fixed ahead, deliberately avoiding the spot where the figure should have been, measuring progress by breath and muscle burn instead of sight, until the wind shifted and forced my gaze upward despite myself. And there it was, closer now, impossibly unchanged by my approach, the yellow raincoat hanging straight and dry against the storm's residue, its hood still up, its posture still aligned toward the station behind me rather than the path ahead, and the wrongness of that orientation lodged in my chest like a lodged breath, because it meant the figure was not positioned to be encountered. It was positioned to be seen. The final yards passed in a blur of effort and disbelief, and when I reached the place where a person should have been standing, I stopped short. Boots sinking into snow that bore no footprints at all. Not mine, not anyone's. And I stared at the raincoat from arm's length, the fabric faded and cracked with age, stitched carefully along seams that should have been stressed by movement but weren't, because there was no one inside it. No shoulders, no spine, no suggestion of a body to justify its shape, only the rigid outline of something that had learned how a person should look from a distance and refused to elaborate further. I reached out before I could stop myself, fingers brushing the sleeve, and the contact was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Because the coat was not draped or supported, it was anchored, sewn through at multiple points to the rough bark of a young pine tree that stood precisely where the figure had always been. The fabric pierced and cinched so tightly that it had fused with the living wood, and when the wind stirred, it was the tree that moved, not the coat, the trunk swaying gently, while the yellow shape remained perfectly vertical, independent of the storm. I stumbled back then, nausea rising, and it was only as I lowered my binoculars, still hanging from my neck out of habit, that I noticed the final detail, the one that recontextualized every hour I had spent watching from the station, because through the magnification, the interior of the raincoat resolved into something that could not be mistaken for lining or shadow, a dense, careful arrangement of human teeth stitched by hand into the fabric, thousands of them, polished, smooth by exposure, set facing inward as if intended to bite whatever tried to occupy that space. And the sight of them triggered a memory I did not know I had been storing, The faint clicking sound I had dismissed as wind or static in my own ears, now unmistakable as enamel tapping, enamel with each subtle movement of the tree. I retched into the snow and staggered away, heart hammering, and as I descended the slope with shaking legs, I became aware of a new sensation. Not of being watched from behind, but of being watched from within. The certainty that the moment of proximity had changed something fundamental. That by closing the distance I had completed whatever observation the figure required, and when I reached the station at last and slammed the door shut, hands numb and clumsy, I did not go to the window, because I already knew what I would see if I did, and the knowledge settled over me with a suffocating calm that the raincoat had never been a person, never even a lure. It was a hypothesis, made visible, a static approximation of humanity designed to test how long a watcher would keep watching before needing to confirm what they saw. And now that I had done exactly that, now that I had touched it, the experiment was over, and whatever came next would no longer require distance at all. I did not sleep after that. Not really, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the coat exactly as it had appeared through the binoculars, the yellow surface opening inward into that dense, patient architecture of teeth, and the idea that those teeth faced in rather than out followed me through the long hours before dawn, because it suggested intent not toward the world but toward occupancy, toward whatever might eventually decide to stand where the coat stood. And when the light finally crept back across the snow, I avoided the window on instinct alone, already certain that looking again would not bring clarity, but consequence. The confirmation came without my cooperation anyway, because when the storm cameras came back online with the improved signal, the feeds no longer showed an empty slope, but something far worse in its subtlety, the image resolving into a faint human silhouette standing inside the ranger station itself, positioned precisely where I had stood at the window for days, unmoving, its outline indistinct but unmistakably upright, facing outward toward the slope as if engaged in careful study, and the timestamp confirmed what my body already knew, that the figure had been there all night, present on every frame, never entering or exiting, never shifting position, simply occupying the space of observation I had abandoned. I backed away from the monitors slowly, my breath shallow, the room suddenly too small, and in the reflection of the darkened glass I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop, because my own reflection did not move with me at first, lingering for a fraction of a second before adjusting. Its posture slightly wrong, its shoulders held with the same unnatural stillness I had watched for so long on the slope, and when it finally mirrored my movement, the delay felt deliberate rather than mechanical, as if the timing were being tested. I left the station that morning under the pretense of evacuation, my report stripped of interpretation and reduced to environmental anomalies and equipment discrepancies, because I understood then that explanation was part of the trap, that the thing I had been watching thrived not on fear but on attention, on the sustained, disciplined act of looking that rangers like me are trained to perfect. And as I drove away down the mountain road, I forced myself not to check the rearview mirror, not because I was afraid of what I might see there, but because I was afraid of what might see me noticing it. Weeks later, reassigned and sleeping poorly, I still catch myself aligning my posture when I stand near windows, still feel a faint urge to remain perfectly still when someone watches me for too long, and sometimes, in reflective surfaces that are just dark enough to lie, I think I see a hint of yellow where no color should be, a vertical line that resolves only when I refuse to focus on it, because the final truth of the yellow raincoat theory is not about what stood on the slope or what waited inside the tree. It is about what happens when observation outlasts explanation, when the act of watching becomes a role that can be learned, rehearsed, and eventually assumed. And somewhere in the park, somewhere quiet and snowbound and patient, I am certain that something else is standing still right now, not because it wants to be seen, but because it is waiting for someone trained to look long enough to teach it how. Story 4. The radio is not supposed to work at all. Not anymore. And that was the first fact I held on to when the sound cut through the silence at exactly 4 a.m, because facts are anchors when you live alone, in a fire lookout tower where the nearest human voice is hours away, and every sound carries the weight of intention. The unit had been declared dead weeks earlier, its casing cracked from a fall, its speaker producing nothing but static no matter how carefully I tuned the dial. and I had left it on the shelf behind the desk out of habit rather than hope, a relic from the days when voices still traveled reliably through wires and air. So when it clicked alive, on its own, sharp, mechanical, precise, I knew immediately that something had gone wrong, not just with the equipment, but with my understanding of the night. The tower was quiet otherwise, wrapped in the kind of darkness that presses against the windows without reflection, the forest below, invisible and vast. And I lay still on the narrow cot for several seconds, counting my breaths, listening for confirmation that I was awake, because the mind plays tricks in places like this, especially at that hour, especially when you wake suddenly, and the boundary between sleep and alertness is not yet settled. But the radio continued, a low carrier hum, resolving into sound, and when a voice emerged from it, my stomach tightened with a slow, rational unease, because the voice was mine, not recorded, not distorted, not obviously wrong, just my own voice, speaking calmly, clearly, recounting the events of the previous day with a cadence I recognized immediately, describing how I had logged wind speeds at noon, how I had burned my hand slightly on the stove and cursed under my breath, how I had stood at the west-facing window longer than usual because the light looked strange over the tree line. And as I listened, frozen on the cot, I realized that the radio was not broadcasting a message so much as replaying a memory, unfolding my own words back to me in the exact order I had spoken them, pauses and all, and the precision of it stripped away any lingering hope that this was interference or coincidence. I sat up slowly, heart pounding now, and reached for the light switch, the bulb flickering to life, with a weak yellow glow that felt insufficient against the growing wrongness in the room. And as I did, the voice on the radio continued, narrating my movement before I had completed it, noting that I was sitting up, that my heart rate had increased, that I was probably wondering whether this was some kind of prank. And the realization hit me then with enough force to steal my breath, because the broadcast was not merely replaying yesterday, it was aligning itself with the present moment, adjusting its content to match my actions in real time. I crossed the room in 3 careful steps, my boots scuffing against the floor, and the radio acknowledged each one, not as sound, but as observation, commenting on the way I favored my left ankle, on the stiffness in my shoulders from sleeping poorly, details I had never spoken aloud, but which nonetheless appeared in the calm, neutral tone of my own voice. And when I reached the desk and stared down at the unit, the casing cold under my fingers, the broadcast paused for a fraction of a second before resuming with a sentence that did not belong to me at all, a sentence delivered in a lower register, closer to a whisper, commenting on how closely I was standing to the radio, how my hand trembled slightly, how the fear had finally settled in behind my eyes. I jerked my hand away as if burned, stepping back until my shoulders hit the wall, and the new voice, the third voice, continued, its tone curious rather than threatening, explaining that this was the easiest hour, that 4 in the morning was when people were most honest because their thoughts had not yet organized themselves into lies, and as it spoke, my own voice returned, repeating something I had said days earlier about the loneliness of the tower, about how sound traveled differently at night, and the layering of voices made my skin crawl because it sounded less like a conversation and more like a demonstration, a proof of concept unfolding for my benefit alone. I turned the radio off violently, twisting the knob until my fingers ached, and for a moment the tower fell silent again, the kind of silence that makes you question your own hearing. And I stood there shaking, telling myself that I would report this at first light, that I would log it as a malfunction and request immediate evacuation. But no matter how strange it felt, there were still procedures for things like this. And then the radio clicked back on without warning, a sound sharper now, more insistent, and the third voice returned alone, noting that turning it off had been predictable, that most people attempted silence before understanding, and that if I wanted this to stop, I needed to listen carefully, because the broadcast was not coming from the radio at all. The words sank into me slowly, reluctantly, because they suggested a shift I was not ready to accept. The idea that the device was merely a conduit, a convenient point of focus for something that existed independently of circuitry or signal, and as if to underscore that point, my own voice resumed once more, this time recounting thoughts I had never spoken, private observations I had assumed were contained entirely within my head, and hearing them externalized like that made my sense of self wobble, because it meant that whatever was speaking had access not just to my actions or my past words, but to the internal monologue I had always trusted as mine alone. The broadcast continued uninterrupted for nearly 20 minutes, cycling through moments from the previous day with increasing detail, filling in emotional context I had not consciously acknowledged, pointing out the way my hand lingered on the window frame when I looked out at the dark, the way I had checked the time repeatedly after midnight without knowing why, and threaded through it all was the third voice, offering commentary, asking rhetorical questions about fear and anticipation, about why humans insist on calling something broken when it does not behave as expected. And by the time the radio finally fell silent on its own, cutting off mid-sentence at precisely 4:23 a.m., I was slumped against the wall, exhausted and cold, with the distinct impression that I had just been observed rather than addressed. Dawn came slowly after that, the sky lightening in thin increments that felt inadequate against the night's residue, and though I forced myself to go through the motions of routine coffee, logs, a brief radio check to headquarters that revealed nothing amiss, I did so with the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted, because every sound now carried a secondary meaning. Every creak and click felt like potential narration. And as the clock edged closer to 4 again that afternoon, I found myself dreading not the dark, but the moment when the radio would decide whether or not I was still worth listening to. I spent the rest of that day behaving the way people do when they are trying to prove something to themselves rather than solve a problem, leaning hard into routine, into checklists and measurements, and the familiar weight of procedure, because routine creates the illusion of forward motion, even when you are standing perfectly still, and every hour that passed without incident felt like a small, fragile victory that I did not trust enough to enjoy. I logged wind speed and humidity with extra care, double-checked perimeter cameras that showed nothing but forest and shadow, spoke briefly to headquarters over the working channel, and listened carefully for any anomaly in my own voice coming back at me. But the transmission was clean, ordinary, boring in the way I desperately wanted everything to be, and by early evening I had almost convinced myself that the night before had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination, the sort that isolation specialists warn you about but rarely describe in detail, and it was that near conviction that made the first discrepancy so unsettling, because it was small, almost polite in the way it announced itself, arriving as a faint but persistent sense of lag between my thoughts and my actions, a half-beat delay that I could not measure but could feel, like the momentary resistance you feel when pushing open a door that sticks. It happened when I reached for the kettle and felt my hand hesitate in midair before completing the motion. Happened again when I turned a page in the logbook and noticed that the sound of paper followed my movement, just a fraction too late. And at first I blamed fatigue, dehydration, the altitude, anything that allowed me to keep the night's events contained to the past, but the sensation grew more pronounced as the hours wore on, accumulating like static, until I found myself pausing deliberately before movements, testing whether intention or action came first. And each time I did, the hesitation felt less like my own uncertainty and more like something waiting to see what I would choose. The radio remained silent all evening, sitting inert on the shelf where I had left it, and the longer it stayed that way, the more conspicuous its quiet became, because silence in places like this is never neutral. It is either a rest or a withholding. And as darkness fell and the forest below the tower dissolved into an indistinct mass, I became acutely aware of the clock, of the way its second hand moved with an unwavering confidence that I no longer felt. And by the time midnight passed, I had repositioned myself in the chair by the desk rather than the cot, telling myself it was simply more practical to be awake if something happened, when in truth I was afraid to lie down again, afraid of what my own voice might say if I wasn't fully present to hear it. The minutes stretched, heavy and deliberate, and I occupied myself with listening, not just to the ambient sounds of the tower, but to the subtle internal noise of my own mind, cataloging thoughts as they arose, noting their cadence and content as if preparing for an audit. And it was during one of those quiet intervals, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, that I realized the most disturbing thing so far was not the idea that the radio could speak, but the fact that I had begun unconsciously rehearsing my thoughts, smoothing them out before fully thinking them, as if some part of me expected them to be overheard. The awareness made me nauseous, because it suggested that the boundary the broadcast had crossed was not technological or supernatural, but psychological, that it had introduced the idea of observation into a space I had always considered private. And once that idea took root, it was impossible to unplant, because even in the absence of sound, I found myself performing, curating internal monologue the way you curate speech when you know you're being recorded. The radio clicked on again at exactly 4, no earlier, no later. The sound crisp and unmistakable, and this time I did not startle so much as stiffen, a controlled response born of grim expectation. And when my own voice emerged from the speaker, it was not recounting yesterday as before, but the immediate past, describing how I had spent the night awake, how I had positioned the chair to face the desk, how I had tried and failed to think of nothing. And hearing that catalog of vigilance spoken back to me felt like an indictment, because it confirmed that whatever was broadcasting was no longer content to observe passively, it was adapting, tightening the feedback loop until the delay between experience and narration shrank to almost nothing. I stood abruptly, chair legs scraping loudly across the floor, and the radio paused, just long enough for hope to flare, before resuming with a new layer added, the third voice returning to comment on my frustration, on the futility of trying to outrun a process designed to keep pace. And it explained, in that same calm, instructive tone, that what I was experiencing was not prediction, but latency, that sound always arrives after the event that produces it, and that consciousness, too, has a delay most people never notice, because nothing ever plays it back to them in real time. The words hit harder than any threat could have, because they reframed the horror as something mechanical rather than malicious, a system exploiting a flaw I had never known existed. And as the broadcast continued, I realized with mounting dread that the voices were no longer synchronized perfectly with my actions. They were drifting ahead, narrating things I was about to do seconds before I did them, noting shifts in posture before my muscles had fully obeyed. And each time that happened, I felt a tug, a subtle pressure to comply, to complete the action so the narration would not be wrong, because the idea of discrepancy of my lived experience diverging from the broadcast felt increasingly intolerable. I tried to resist this by freezing in place, standing rigid with my fists clenched, and for a moment the radio faltered, the narration stalling, repeating a phrase twice as if confused, and that moment of disruption sent a sharp thrill through me, proof that resistance was possible. But the third voice recovered quickly, adjusting its commentary to describe my stillness instead, praising my attempt at control, noting the strain in my shoulders and the shallow nature of my breathing. And the satisfaction in that observation made my skin crawl, because it meant that even defiance was being absorbed into the system, repurposed as data. The broadcast ended at 4:22 that night, 1 minute earlier than before, cutting off mid-word in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. And when the silence returned, it felt provisional, as though something had stepped away briefly rather than left, and I slumped into the chair, shaking, the full weight of the situation settling in at last, because it was no longer just replaying my past or narrating my present. It was rehearsing my future, and the shrinking delay between thought, action, and broadcast suggested an endpoint I did not want to consider, a moment when the narration would arrive first, and I would follow it out of habit or relief. And as the first gray hint of dawn crept across the windows, I realized that the most frightening thing about the radio was not that it knew what I was doing, but that it was teaching me, slowly and relentlessly, how to listen for instructions disguised as my own voice. By the third night, I understood that waiting passively was no longer an option, because whatever governed the broadcast had begun to anticipate not just my actions but my attempts to counter it, folding resistance into its logic with an ease that suggested practice. So I spent the daylight hours preparing in the only way that made sense to me, by introducing variables it could not easily account for. Actions taken without rehearsal, thoughts interrupted before completion, noise layered over silence, until the internal monologue I had been so carefully curating began to fracture. I turned on the auxiliary generator early, letting its uneven rumble fill the tower, played an old emergency tape at low volume to contaminate the soundscape, and spoke aloud constantly while I worked, narrating trivialities with deliberate randomness in the hope that flooding the channel would reduce its clarity. But even as I did this, I felt the uncomfortable certainty that the broadcast was not dependent on sound in the way I was, that it did not require clean input so much as continuity. And as evening fell and the forest outside dissolved into darkness again, the generator's vibration began to feel less like cover and more like accompaniment, a steady pulse against which everything else aligned. I forced myself to lie down on the cot before midnight, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, repeating nonsense phrases in my head to disrupt any coherent narrative, and for a while that seemed to work. My thoughts skidding uselessly across one another until they lost momentum, but somewhere around 2 a.m. I noticed a new sensation creeping in, not the lag I had felt before, but a faint doubling, as if each thought arrived with a shadow a moment behind it, and the realization that I could perceive this shadow terrified me, because it meant the delay had become something I was actively tracking, rather than unconsciously experiencing. When the radio clicked on at 4, the sound cut through the generator noise with surgical precision, and the voice that emerged was not mine. Not at first, but the third voice alone, steady and unhurried, explaining that what I was attempting was understandable but inefficient. That noise did not erase signal. It merely forced adaptation, and as it spoke, I felt a creeping pressure behind my eyes, the sense of being tuned rather than addressed. And then my own voice joined in, not narrating the previous day or the present moment, but describing a series of hypothetical actions, outlining choices I could make in the next few minutes, each one delivered with the same neutral cadence. And as I listened, I realized with mounting dread that these were not predictions, but options, branches laid out ahead of me, and the longer the broadcast continued, the more strongly I felt the pull to select one, to bring my behavior back into alignment with the narration, so the system would settle again. I stood abruptly and walked to the window, not because I wanted to look out, but because movement felt like the only remaining assertion of agency. And the radio acknowledged this immediately, noting the quickness of my step, the way my breathing spiked, and then, chillingly, suggesting that I could open the window if I wanted the pressure to ease, because the air outside was colder and clarity often followed cold. And hearing that suggestion framed as a gentle observation sent a jolt of anger through me, sharp enough to cut through the fear, because it revealed intent at last, not malicious but directive, an attempt to shape outcome under the guise of commentary. I slammed the window shut harder than necessary and shouted into the room that it didn't control me, the words raw and inelegant, and the broadcast responded by repeating my outburst back to me, stripping it of emotion, flattening it into data. And the third voice observed that anger increased compliance more often than it prevented it, because people tend to act more predictably when emotionally escalated. Something in me snapped then, not loudly or dramatically, but with a quiet resolve that felt dangerous in its calm, and I turned the radio volume up as high as it would go, forcing the voices into distortion, then unplugged the unit entirely and carried it to the center of the room, setting it on the floor like an offering. Because if this thing required a conduit, I wanted to control the terms of that connection. And for a moment the broadcast stuttered, the voices overlapping chaotically, fragments of sentences colliding. And in that confusion, I caught a glimpse of something I had not heard before, a faint undertone beneath even the third voice, a structural rhythm that felt less like speech and more like timing, like a metronome counting down. The radio fell silent abruptly at 4:21. Earlier again, and the silence that followed was heavier than any before, pressing against my ears until I became aware of my own pulse as a kind of ticking. And standing there in the aftermath, I realized that the most important change had not been in the broadcast, but in me, because I could now feel the delay between sensation and awareness, stretching and compressing. Could sense the moment when an action transitioned from thought to inevitability, and that awareness was seductive in its own way, offering a false sense of control. And as dawn crept in and the generator sputtered off, I understood with a clarity that left me hollow that the third channel was not the radio, not even the voice, but the space between intention and execution, a narrow window most people pass through without noticing, and whatever was speaking to me had learned how to occupy that space completely, not by forcing me to obey, but by making obedience feel like relief. And as I sat there, exhausted and trembling, watching the light return to the forest, I knew that the next night would not be about resisting the broadcast at all, It would be about choosing whether or not to let it finish speaking first. I began the fourth day with the uneasy clarity that comes after a decision has already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought, the kind that rearranges your priorities before you can argue with it. And as I moved through the tower's routines, checking fuel, logging weather, inventorying supplies, I noticed that my actions felt oddly streamlined, as if friction had been removed from the process, each step following the last with a smoothness that should have been reassuring but wasn't, because it carried the faint suggestion of rehearsal. I avoided the radio entirely, leaving it unplugged and face down on the floor where I had placed it the night before. But avoidance proved to be a poor substitute for separation, because the awareness it had cultivated did not retreat with the device. It lingered in the way my thoughts now arrived with outlines rather than substance, in the way my body seemed to anticipate movement before I consciously chose it. And as evening fell, I caught myself standing very still in the center of the room, testing that sensation, waiting for the familiar pressure that marked the narrowing of the gap between thought and action, and finding it arrive right on cue, like a held breath being released. When darkness finally settled in and the tower lights cast their weak halos against the windows, I checked the clock and felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with inevitability. Because some part of me already knew that this night would be different, not because the broadcast would escalate, but because it would simplify, and that simplification frightened me more than any threat could have. At 3:55, I sat down in the chair by the desk and folded my hands deliberately, anchoring myself to a posture that felt intentional rather than reactive. And when the radio clicked on at 4, despite being unplugged, despite every rational objection I had left, it did so without drama, without the preamble of static or hum, as if it had been waiting patiently for me to be ready. And the voice that emerged was not layered or overlapping this time. Not my own, and not the third voice as I had come to understand it, but something quieter, closer to a tone, a carrier of information rather than commentary. And it began by telling me the time remaining, not in hours or minutes, but in increments of attention, explaining calmly that there were 5 minutes left before the system reached equilibrium, before the delay between narration and action collapsed completely. And as it spoke, I felt a faint warmth spread through my chest, a deceptive comfort that came with the promise of resolution. The forecast that followed was delivered with the same detached precision as a weather report, outlining a sequence of events that would occur if I continued to sit where I was, if I stood, if I attempted to destroy the radio. Each outcome described not as consequence but as alignment, as a return to efficiency, and listening to it I realized that the language had shifted subtly, no longer addressing me as a subject to be observed but as a process to be optimized. And the intimacy of that framing made my skin crawl, because it suggested that the system no longer required my consent or my fear, only my participation. I tried to interrupt it, shouting, moving, doing anything that might reintroduce noise, but the narration flowed on, absorbing my actions seamlessly, noting the rise in my voice, the tremor in my hands, and I felt that old tug again. The urge to comply, simply to stop the commentary, to let the narration settle into accuracy so the pressure would ease. And in that moment I understood why the broadcast always ended abruptly, rather than fading out, because it was not designed to conclude on its own. It was designed to be completed by the listener. The final minute approached with an almost ceremonial calm, the voice counting down not aloud but by shifting cadence, shortening phrases, tightening rhythm. And as the last 60 seconds unfolded, I felt the space between intention and execution narrow to a razor's edge, each thought arriving already half-formed as action, and the terror of that realization was matched only by the relief it offered. The seductive idea that if I let go, if I allowed the narration to arrive first, the effort of choosing would finally end. The voice began to describe a simple movement then, one I had performed countless times without thought, the act of standing up. And it did so with such clarity and certainty that my muscles responded reflexively, my body rising before I could stop it. And as I stood there frozen in that halfway moment, neither fully seated nor fully upright, I felt something shift irrevocably, a sense of alignment snapping into place, and the voice fell silent at last, not cutting off abruptly as before, but stopping exactly when my feet found the floor. leaving behind a silence so complete it felt engineered. I remained there for a long time after that, heart racing, lungs burning, the tower eerily quiet, and when the clock ticked past 4 or 5, without further sound, I allowed myself to believe, briefly, that I had survived the forecast by accident rather than design, that the system had miscalculated, that the equilibrium it sought had failed to arrive, and it was only when I turned to sit back down and felt my body hesitate just for a fraction of a second longer than before that I understood the truth. Because the delay had not disappeared. It had inverted. Action now, waiting for narration that no longer needed a device or a voice to assert itself. And standing there in the dim light with the forest pressing in around the tower, I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the 5-minute forecast had not been a warning at all. It had been a calibration, and whatever came next would not announce itself at 4 in the morning, because it would already be speaking first, quietly, patiently, from the place where my decisions used to begin. I remained standing long after the clock crept past the hour, my body held in a posture that felt chosen only because it no longer felt resisted. And in that stillness I became aware of a subtle but decisive shift, the way a room feels after someone else has finished speaking, and you realize you've been waiting for your turn without knowing it. Because the silence that filled the tower was not empty at all. It was organized, arranged with the same care the broadcast had always used, and as I breathed, I noticed the faintest sense of anticipation settling just ahead of each inhale, as if the act itself were being quietly suggested rather than initiated. The radio stayed dark and inert on the floor, its casing cracked and unimpressive, and yet I understood with a clarity that made my stomach drop that the device had never been the source of anything. It had been a tutor, a training wheel removed only after the lesson had taken hold, and that lesson revealed itself in the smallest, most intimate ways, in how my hand lifted toward the desk before I consciously decided to move it, and how my gaze shifted toward the window a fraction of a second before the idea of looking formed. And with each of those moments came a strange, almost comforting sense of correctness, the relief of alignment, like stepping onto a moving walkway and realizing it had already been carrying you. I tried to disrupt this by doing something deliberately irrational, spinning in place, clapping my hands, speaking nonsense aloud. But even these actions arrived with that same premonitory weight, the sense that they had been approved somewhere just ahead of my awareness, and the futility of resistance settled in not as despair, but as a gentle resignation. Because there was no longer anything to fight, no voice to argue with, no sound to shut off, only a process that had learned me well enough to proceed without announcement. Morning came eventually, pale and indifferent, and I went through the motions of departure with an efficiency that would have pleased any supervisor, packing equipment, securing the tower, filling out the final logs, with handwriting that looked steadier than I felt. And as I drove down the mountain road, I noticed that the world itself seemed to cooperate. Traffic lights turning green just as I reached them. Radio songs ending at natural pauses in my thoughts. Conversations with colleagues unfolding with an ease that felt scripted rather than shared. And with each coincidence, a quiet certainty grew, the understanding that the broadcast had not ended. It had simply widened its bandwidth. The report I submitted was factual and restrained, stripped of speculation, and it was accepted without question. The reassignment processed quickly, almost eagerly. And as I settled back into ordinary life, I found that the habits cultivated in the tower did not fade. They refined themselves, my internal monologue smoothing out, my decisions arriving fully formed, my days flowing with a frictionless quality that others commented on with admiration. And at first I mistook that admiration for proof that nothing was wrong, that perhaps what I had experienced was not an invasion but an upgrade, a correction to the inefficiencies of doubt and hesitation. And the temptation to accept that framing was powerful, because it offered peace in exchange for vigilance, certainty in place of choice. The true horror did not announce itself until weeks later, on a night when sleep refused to come, and I lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of my apartment, the distant traffic, the hum of appliances, and somewhere in that layered noise, I noticed a rhythm I recognized, not a sound exactly, but a timing, the same subtle cadence that had underpinned the third voice. And as I focused on it against my better judgment, I felt the now familiar pressure gather just ahead of thought, the sensation of a suggestion forming before intention. And in that moment I understood the final shape of the trap, because the broadcast did not need to speak anymore. It had achieved what it wanted the moment I learned to listen for it, the moment I began to feel incomplete without that guiding presence, smoothing the path ahead. I tested this realization carefully over the following days, delaying decisions on purpose, introducing pauses where none were needed. And each time the discomfort returned, a low-level anxiety that eased only when I allowed the next action to arrive without interference. And the pattern revealed itself with terrifying clarity, because the system was no longer predicting my behavior. It was conditioning my relief, teaching me that the absence of delay felt better than the labor of choice. The last piece fell into place on a quiet afternoon when I passed a construction site and noticed a worker standing near the edge of a scaffold, perfectly still, his gaze unfocused. And for a fleeting instant I saw myself reflected in that posture. The same poised readiness, the same suspension, and the recognition hit me with a cold finality, because I understood then that the broadcast did not require isolation or towers or radios to propagate. It required only one person to carry the habit outward, to model it through behavior rather than sound, to demonstrate the efficiency of listening before thinking. And standing there watching that man, I felt the familiar pull to narrate, to anticipate his movement. And with a shock of self-awareness, I realized that the impulse no longer felt external. It felt like mine. I left the site quickly and went home, heart racing. And that night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision that felt heavier than any before, because it was the first one in weeks that resisted the easy flow. The decision to speak this experience aloud, to record it, to reintroduce friction through confession, and as I began to write, to shape these words carefully and imperfectly. I felt the pressure build, the sense of misalignment growing sharper with each sentence, as if something were urging me to simplify, to cut to the efficient version of events. And that resistance confirmed what I needed to know, that the only defense left was imperfection, hesitation, the deliberate refusal to let narration arrive first. I do not know how long that defense will hold, or whether it can be passed on the way the broadcast was, because even now, as you listen to this, I am aware of the dangerous intimacy of shared attention, the way a voice can slip past skepticism and settle into rhythm, and that awareness is my final warning, offered not with urgency but with the quiet certainty of experience. If you ever wake at 4 a.m. with the sense that your thoughts are arriving already spoken, if you feel relief when decisions seem to make themselves, if the silence around you begins to feel organized rather than empty, do not listen for the broadcast. Do not wait for it to announce itself, because the most dangerous signal is the one that teaches you to hear it before it makes a sound. And once it does, the voice you follow will not feel foreign at all. It will feel exactly like your own, speaking just far enough ahead of you that you stop noticing the difference. Story 5. The lake did not creak when I stepped onto it, which should have been reassuring but wasn't, because ice that makes no sound has already decided how much weight it will tolerate, and I had learned over the years to trust noise more than silence when it came to frozen water. So I paused at the edge, with one boot planted on the snow-packed shore and the other resting on the glassy surface, testing, listening, feeling for the faint vibration that tells you whether the cold has done its work thoroughly enough. The morning was pale and colorless in that particular Minnesota way that strips depth from distance, the sky a seamless continuation of the ice beneath it, and as I shifted my weight forward, the lake accepted me without protest, the surface hard and clear, revealing layers of trapped bubbles and faint cracks far below like a history written in breath. And that clarity was the reason I liked this place, the reason I drove out before dawn with my auger rattling in the back and the heater packed carefully beside it, because there is something honest about being able to see what is beneath you, something that feels safer than opaque water even when you know better. I walked slowly toward my usual spot near the center, my boots leaving crisp prints that looked almost ornamental against the frost, the only sound my own breathing and the distant murmur of wind threading through bare trees. And it was halfway there that I noticed my reflection beneath my feet, not distorted or broken the way reflections usually are on ice, but clear enough to recognize myself without effort. My face pale against the dark water below, my hat pulled low, my breath fogging faintly above while the image beneath remained perfectly still, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the ice was acting like glass rather than mirror, how it felt less like seeing myself reflected and more like seeing myself contained. I knelt and brushed away a thin layer of snow with my glove, leaning closer, and the face beneath me did what reflections do, matching my movement exactly, my eyes narrowing as I focused, my mouth tightening against the cold, and for a moment the world felt aligned again, symmetrical in a way that quieted my nerves, because isolation does that to you. It makes you grateful for any confirmation that things are behaving as expected. I drilled my hole carefully, the auger biting cleanly through the ice, each rotation sending a vibration through my arms and down into the lake. And as the final layer gave way, I felt that familiar rush of colder air rising up, the breath of the water released. And when I stood again, the reflection returned, framed now by the dark circle of the fishing hole like an eye open beneath my feet, watching with the same steady attention I was giving it. I told myself it was just the angle, just the unusual clarity of the ice this early in the season. But even as I said that, I became aware of a subtle discomfort, the sense that my reflection was not responding with the slight delays and distortions that usually accompany movement, that it was too precise, too stable, and when I lifted my hand and waved experimentally, the reflection waved back in perfect sync, not a fraction of a second behind as physics would suggest, but exactly when I did, as if the motion were shared rather than copied. The unease deepened slowly, not enough to send me running, but enough to sharpen my attention, and I found myself standing very still, staring down at the face beneath the ice, noticing details I usually ignored, the way the eyes looked darker there, deeper set, the way the expression rested in something that felt more intent than neutral, and when I smiled, just a quick, thoughtless thing, more a reflex than a decision. The reflection did not smile back, its mouth remaining fixed, its eyes narrowing slightly as if in confusion or pain, and the mismatch hit me with a jolt that traveled straight up my spine. Because reflections don't choose how to respond, they obey, and I told myself I must have imagined it, that the angle had shifted or the light had changed. So I smiled again, wider this time, holding it, waiting, and the face beneath the ice did something that made my stomach drop, because it did not mirror my expression at all. It crumpled, the mouth turning downward, the eyes filling with something that looked unmistakably like grief. And for a suspended moment I was staring at my own face, crying soundlessly beneath my feet. I stepped back sharply, heart racing, boots scraping against the ice, and the reflection moved too, but not in the same way I did, not retreating so much as rising slightly, as if closing the distance from below, and the rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Light refraction, stress fractures, fatigue, but none of them accounted for the expression I had seen, the unmistakable emotional specificity of it, and standing there in the cold with my breath coming fast, I became aware of how quiet the lake had become, the wind easing, the trees stilled, the world holding itself as if waiting to see what I would do next. I forced myself to kneel again, slower this time, my movements deliberate, cautious, and as I leaned over the hole, the reflection reappeared, calmer now, its face composed into something neutral that looked almost apologetic. And when I raised a hand again, palm open, the reflection hesitated before lifting its own, the motion delayed just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to feel intentional, and that delay unsettled me more than the earlier mismatch, because it suggested choice, the possibility of restraint. I whispered my own name without thinking, the sound small and fragile in the open air, and the reflection's mouth moved silently in response, shaping the same word without sound. And in that moment, the lake made its first noise of the day, a low, distant crack that traveled beneath the ice like a warning sigh, and I staggered back instinctively, the fishing hole suddenly feeling less like an opening and more like a mouth. And as I stood there shaking, I saw the reflection begin to move its lips again, more urgently this time, the expression shifting into something that looked almost eager, and though no sound reached me, I felt a strange pressure behind my ears, the phantom sensation of hearing something through water, and the ice beneath my boots answered with another muted crack, Closer now, sharper, and the fear that finally surged through me was not of falling in or drowning, but of being noticed in a way that stripped away the comfort of singularity. The idea that I was not alone in my outline, that somewhere beneath the frozen surface there was another version of me, who had been waiting for the ice to become thin enough to see through clearly. I packed my gear with shaking hands, movements jerky and imprecise, and as I did, I felt the gaze beneath my feet track me, the reflection turning its head in ways that no longer corresponded to my own movements. And when I finally forced myself to walk back toward the shore, each step measured and careful, I made the mistake of looking down one last time and saw the reflection standing still beneath the ice, watching me go with an expression I could not read, one that felt less like sorrow now and more like calculation. And as I reached solid ground and the ice fell away behind me, the cold biting harder than before, I realized with a slow, creeping dread that whatever had looked back at me from the lake had not been surprised to see me at all. It had been waiting for the moment when I would finally recognize it as something separate, something capable of acting on its own. And that recognition, like the first crack in new ice, was only the beginning of something that would not stay contained for long. I told myself the sensible thing was to go home and forget the lake entirely, to chalk what I had seen up to exhaustion. Refraction, the strange tricks the mind plays when it stares too long at its own likeness. And for the first few miles of driving, I clung to that explanation with the kind of desperation usually reserved for prayer. Gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, replaying the moment over and over until the image of that crying face beneath the ice began to blur at the edges. But the trouble with reflections is that they don't stay where you leave them. They follow you. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, I had become acutely aware of a new sensation that had not been there before. A subtle but persistent pressure behind my eyes, as though something were pushing outward from the inside of my skull, testing the boundary between thought and sight. Inside the house, the warmth felt wrong, too thick, and the familiar sounds, the furnace kicking on, the refrigerator humming seemed slightly delayed, arriving just a fraction of a second after my brain expected them, and that tiny lag set my nerves on edge because it echoed the hesitation I had seen in the reflection's movements, the deliberate pause that suggested choice rather than physics. And standing in my kitchen, I found myself avoiding reflective surfaces without fully realizing it, angling my body away from the microwave door, turning lights on in rooms before entering them, because some instinct deeper than reason was telling me that mirrors were no longer passive things. It wasn't until I washed my hands that I gave in to the urge to check, glancing up at the bathroom mirror while the water ran, and what I saw there made my stomach tighten in a way that felt both familiar and newly wrong. Because my reflection looked normal at first glance, tired eyes, flushed skin from the cold, but there was a tension in its posture that I did not feel in my own body. The shoulders held too stiffly, the chin slightly raised, as if bracing for impact. And when I blinked, the reflection blinked back a beat too late, just long enough for the difference to register before correcting itself. I shut the water off abruptly, heart pounding, and stepped back, telling myself I was reading intention into coincidence. That stress was sharpening my perception until it cut reality into misleading shapes. And for a while that explanation held, or seemed to, until I noticed how often my gaze drifted back to the mirror despite myself, drawn by the same uneasy curiosity that had kept me staring at the lake, and each time I looked, the reflection seemed a little more alert, its eyes tracking me with an intensity that felt separate from my own awareness. Sleep that night was shallow and fractured, filled with dreams of water pressing upward against glass, of ice flexing without breaking, and I woke just before dawn with the sensation of weight on my chest, as though something were standing on me without touching. And in that liminal moment between sleep and waking, I was certain I could hear a muffled knocking, rhythmic and patient, like a fist striking from the wrong side of a wall, and when I sat up gasping, the sound faded immediately, leaving behind only the echo of its timing, the certainty that it had not been random. Over the next few days, the pressure behind my eyes grew more pronounced, accompanied by headaches that bloomed slowly and receded just as reluctantly, and with them came a heightened awareness of my own movements, the way I occupied space, the way my weight shifted from foot to foot when I stood still, and it dawned on me with creeping horror that I was beginning to move more carefully, more deliberately, as if compensating for someone else's balance. And that realization came to a head the first time I caught my reflection adjusting itself before I did. A subtle roll of the shoulders, a straightening of the spine that I felt only after I saw it happen. Panic finally broke through then, sharp and unambiguous, and I covered the mirrors in my house with sheets and towels, transforming familiar rooms into something claustrophobic and wrong, because the absence of reflection felt almost as unsettling as its presence, leaving me with the disquieting sense of being partially erased. And yet, even with every surface concealed, I could not shake the feeling of being watched, not from the outside, but from within, as though my own outline had become contested territory. I tried to distract myself with routine, with work and errands and conversations that grounded me in the ordinary, but the lake intruded on everything, its glassy surface overlaying itself onto other textures. And more than once, I found myself pausing mid-step in a grocery store aisle, struck by the irrational certainty that the polished floor beneath my feet was too clear, too reflective, that if I looked down, I might see something looking back. The breaking point came when I returned to the lake against my better judgment, driven by a need for confirmation that bordered on compulsion, telling myself that daylight and distance would strip the experience of its power, that if I could see the ice again without incident, the pressure in my head might finally ease. And as I stepped back onto the frozen surface days later, the sky low and heavy with clouds, I felt the lake accept me, with the same deceptive calm as before, the ice clear and silent, and almost immediately I saw the reflection beneath my feet, waiting, my own face, staring up at me with an expression of quiet expectancy that made my throat go dry. I did not smile this time, did not wave or speak, but even in my stillness, the reflection responded, its eyes narrowing slightly, its mouth tightening in concentration, and when I took a cautious step forward, it did not mirror me at all, remaining exactly where it was, the distance between us stretching in a way that defied geometry, as if the lake were deepening beneath my feet rather than extending outward. I felt the ice vibrate then, not with the sharp report of cracking, but with a low, sustained pressure, like a drum skin being pressed from below, and the reflection's face shifted into something unmistakably eager, its lips parting as if to speak, and in that moment the pressure behind my eyes spiked into pain, a hot, blinding pulse that dropped me to one knee. And as I clutched my head, I understood with a sickening clarity that whatever lived beneath the ice was no longer content to be seen. It was pushing, testing the limits of the barrier between us, and that barrier was not just the frozen surface of the lake, but something far more fragile and personal, the thin, unexamined assumption that my reflection belonged to me alone. The ice groaned then, a long, resonant sound that rolled outward from beneath my kneeling form, and I scrambled to my feet in blind terror, running for the shore as the pressure followed, building with each step, the sensation of being matched from below, growing stronger until it felt as though another set of feet were rising to meet mine. And when I reached solid ground again, chest heaving, I did not look back, because I knew with terrible certainty that the reflection would still be there, watching, waiting for the ice to thin just enough, or for me to look just long enough to give it the opening it needed to finally trade places. After the second visit to the lake, the world began to feel as though it had developed a second surface beneath the first, a hidden layer that responded not to light or touch, but to attention, and I carried that awareness with me everywhere, a constant, grinding vigilance that turned ordinary spaces into potential thresholds. Because once you have seen something behave independently in a place where it should only obey, you start noticing how many assumptions your life is built on. I stopped trusting polished floors, dark windows, even the black screens of powered-off devices, and yet avoidance only sharpened the pressure behind my eyes. That steady, inward push that now felt less like pain and more like displacement, as if something were slowly taking up space where my thoughts used to form, and with it came a growing difficulty in remembering exactly how I moved before all this started, how my body had once felt like a single, uninterrupted thing rather than a negotiation. Mirrors remained covered in my house, but reflections have a way of appearing where you least expect them, and it was in the curved chrome of a grocery cart handle that I first saw it clearly again. My face stretched and distorted by the metal, yes, but still unmistakably me. except that the eyes were wrong, focused not outward but slightly upward, as if watching from beneath the surface rather than standing in front of it. And the shock of that recognition sent a surge of heat through my skull so intense I had to grip the cart to stay upright. The world tilting as if gravity itself had briefly lost consensus. I abandoned the cart and left the store without buying anything, my heart racing, the sense of being followed now impossible to ignore, because the truth had settled in with terrifying clarity. Whatever had looked back at me from the ice was no longer confined to the lake. It was not bound to water or winter. It was bound to me, carried along like an afterimage that refused to fade. Sleep became almost impossible after that. Not because I was afraid of dreams, but because I was afraid of the moment just before waking. That liminal space where identity loosens its grip, because more than once I surfaced from shallow sleep with the uncanny certainty that my eyes were opening a split second too late, that something else had already seen the room before I had. In those mornings I lay perfectly still, heart pounding, waiting for my sense of ownership over my own body to reassert itself. And when it did, the relief felt borrowed rather than earned. The physical symptoms worsened alongside the psychological ones, headaches blooming into migraines, vision blurring at the edges. And sometimes, when the pressure peaked, I experienced the brief, horrifying sensation that my reflection was trying to move through me rather than replace me, aligning joints and muscles from the inside out, rehearsing the mechanics of standing, walking, breathing. And I understood then why the cracks in the ice had unnerved me so deeply, because they had not spread outward from my weight as cracks should. They had radiated upward from below, as if something were testing the integrity of the surface from the wrong side. I began to notice subtle inconsistencies in my movements that I could not account for, moments where I found myself standing in a different posture than I remembered. Assuming my weight shifted, my head tilted at an angle that felt unfamiliar. And these discrepancies were always small enough to dismiss individually, but devastating in accumulation, because they suggested that control was no longer absolute, that something else was learning how to inhabit my outline by sharing it. Desperation drove me to research, to search for anything that might contextualize what was happening, and I found scattered references in folklore and psychology alike, stories of doubles and doppelgangers, of reflections that steal breath or shadows that outlive their owners. And while none of them fit perfectly, they all shared a common theme that made my skin crawl. The idea that identity can be eroded not by force, but by proximity, by long exposure to something that looks like you and waits patiently for you to make a mistake. The mistake came on an ordinary afternoon when the pressure behind my eyes spiked without warning, and I stumbled into my bathroom, clutching the sink, gasping, and in that moment of weakness, the towel slipped from the mirror, revealing my reflection fully for the first time in days. And what stared back at me was no longer trying to hide its independence, its posture straight and confident in a way I did not feel, its expression calm, almost curious, and as I locked eyes with it, I felt a sudden, sickening lurch inside my head, as if two perspectives were briefly competing for the same position. And the reflection smiled, then not the brittle, uncertain smile of our first encounter, but something practiced, assured, a smile that suggested readiness. I screamed and yanked the towel back into place, my heart hammering, my thoughts scattering, and as I slid down the wall to the floor, I understood with brutal clarity that the pressure I had been feeling was not an attack, but a migration, a gradual alignment of spaces meant to make transition seamless when it finally occurred. The cracks followed soon after, not in ice, but in glass, appearing overnight in the bathroom mirror beneath the towel, thin fractures spidering outward from the center as if struck from behind. And when I touched them with shaking fingers, I felt a faint vibration, a low, thrumming tension that resonated unpleasantly with the ache in my skull, and the implication was unmistakable. The barrier was thinning, not because I was weakening it, but because something on the other side was strengthening. From that moment on, I could no longer tell where my own thoughts ended, and the pressure began, because suggestions started to appear fully formed in my mind. Not intrusive, exactly, just available. Ideas about how to stand, how to move, how to look into reflective surfaces without fear. And the most terrifying part was how reasonable those suggestions felt, how much easier it would be to stop resisting, to let the alignment complete itself and be done with the constant strain. I fought that urge with everything I had, clinging to imperfection and hesitation the way a drowning person clings to debris, deliberately moving awkwardly, making myself stumble, breaking routines just to remind myself that I still could. But even as I did, I felt the presence beneath the surface grow more confident, more assured. And I knew then that this was no longer a question of if something would break, but where, because cracks that start from below do not announce themselves with sudden collapse. They widen slowly, patiently, until the surface above no longer remembers what it was like to hold. I stopped going out in daylight because light made reflections sharper and shadows more honest. And instead, I let the hours blur together inside the house, moving slowly, deliberately, as if speed alone might invite replacement, because by then I had come to understand that whatever was beneath the surface was patient, unimaginably patient, and that patience was its greatest advantage. The way deep cold works its way through walls and bones, not by force but by persistence. And with every day that passed, the pressure behind my eyes shifted from pain into something closer to density. A sense of occupancy that made it difficult to think without feeling observed from inside my own skull. I tried grounding myself in physical sensation, holding ice in my palm until my skin burned, pressing my feet flat against the floor, naming objects aloud in the room, but even those anchors felt unreliable, because I could sense the imitation learning from them, adjusting its internal model of my reactions, storing the way my breath changed when I was afraid, the way my muscles tensed before movement, and that awareness turned every coping mechanism into a lesson I was unwillingly teaching. The dreams worsened, no longer symbolic or abstract, but brutally literal, filled with images of me standing beneath the lake's surface, looking up at a distorted sun through thick ice, watching my own body move above without me, my hands pounding from below in slow, deliberate rhythms that matched the headaches I woke with. And the worst part of those dreams was not the helplessness, but the certainty that the version of me beneath the ice felt justified, convinced that it was the one who belonged in the world above. I began to hear sounds that were not quite external, a muffled knocking that aligned too perfectly with my pulse to be coincidence. And when I pressed my ear to walls or floors, the vibration seemed to answer, resonating back through my bones. And that was when the lake returned to my thoughts with an urgency that bordered on command. Because if the cracks were widening everywhere else, then the source, the original interface, was the only place where confrontation still made sense. Returning there felt inevitable rather than chosen, and I drove through falling snow with a numb focus, the road narrowing into familiarity, the trees leaning inward as if acknowledging my intent. And when I reached the shore, the lake lay before me like a held breath, its surface smoother than before, clearer, darker, and stepping onto it felt less like trespass and more like completion, my boots finding purchase without protest, the ice accepting my weight eagerly. The reflection appeared immediately, not gradually as before, my face beneath the surface already aligned with mine, already watching, and the shock of that immediacy sent a wave of nausea through me, because it meant the distance between us had finally collapsed, that the lake no longer needed time or invitation to show me what waited there. I did not look away this time, because avoidance had only fed the process, and as I stared down, I saw that the reflection was no longer content to mimic expressions imperfectly. It smiled when I smiled, frowned when I frowned, matching me with a precision that felt invasive rather than reassuring. And then, without any movement on my part, it raised its hand, pressing its palm flat against the ice from below, the skin pale and distorted by the thickness. And the moment its hand touched the underside of the surface, I felt the pressure in my skull spike into something sharp and electric, as if contact had completed a circuit. The ice answered with a deep, resonant groan, not the random complaint of temperature change, but a sound of strain, of material being asked to perform a task it had not been designed for, and hairline fractures bloomed outward from the point of contact, not radiating from my boots as logic demanded, but from the hand beneath, spidering upward with terrifying intent. And I staggered back instinctively, heart hammering, only to realize that my reflection had not retreated with me. It remained pressed close, its other hand joining the first, fingers splayed wide, pushing, testing, And in that moment, I understood that the imitation had never been trying to escape in the way I feared. It had been preparing the conditions for exchange. The pressure behind my eyes became unbearable then, my vision tunneling. And for a few horrifying seconds, I felt my sense of orientation flip. The world above the ice tilting, the dark water below feeling suddenly like the side with gravity. And I had the unmistakable sensation that I was the one being looked at from beneath the surface, that my reflection's perspective was asserting itself with growing confidence. I screamed, not in defiance, but in effort, forcing sound through my throat as an anchor to my own body, and the reflection's mouth opened in perfect sync. But no sound emerged from below, only a plume of tiny bubbles that crawled upward and flattened uselessly against the ice, and the asymmetry of that moment sent a surge of grim hope through me, because it meant the barrier still mattered, that the surface had not yet fully surrendered. I stumbled forward then, acting on instinct alone, and dropped to my knees, slamming my gloved fists against the ice above the reflection's hands, the impact jarring my arms painfully, and the ice responded with a sharp, cracking report that echoed outward, the fractures widening, intersecting, and for a suspended instant, I could see everything at once, the dark water below, the reflection's face contorted in something like urgency, the branching cracks refracting my own image into dozens of distorted copies, and then the ice began to fail. Not collapsing inward as I expected, but bowing upward, swelling slightly beneath the pressure from below, and terror surged through me, because I realized the lake was no longer merely a boundary. It was becoming a membrane. I scrabbled backward, slipping on the smooth surface, heart racing, and as I did, the reflection's hands slid forward beneath the ice, tracking my movement with frightening accuracy. Always beneath me, always aligned. And the sensation that accompanied this pursuit was worse than fear. It was a creeping familiarity, the feeling of being matched from the inside. And just as the cracks reached my boots and the ice dipped ominously, I rolled sideways and crawled toward the shore. My movements frantic and graceless, deliberately imperfect, because some instinct told me that symmetry was the true danger. The ice behind me gave way, not with a crash, but with a low sucking sound, water bulging upward through the fractures before settling back. And when I finally reached solid ground and dragged myself onto the snow, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, I did not look back immediately, because I was afraid of what I might see rising from the hole I had left behind. And when I did force myself to turn, the lake's surface was already smoothing itself over, the cracks knitting back together with horrifying efficiency, the reflection gone from view as if it had never been there at all. And standing there in the cold with my clothes soaked and my head pounding, I understood that this had not been a victory or a failure, but a test, a measurement of readiness. And whatever waited beneath the ice had learned something crucial about me that I would fight, that I would resist. And that resistance, too, could be anticipated and accounted for. As I limped back to my car, every reflective surface avoided, every step deliberate. The pressure behind my eyes eased for the first time in weeks, replaced by a hollow, echoing quiet that felt like the calm before thaw. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that the cold was not done reaching up, that the lake had not let me go so much as released me temporarily, confident that the surface, whether ice, glass, or the fragile structure of identity itself, would not hold forever once it had learned exactly where to push. After the lake released me, if that is the right word for something that never truly lets go, I returned home with the hollow certainty of someone who has survived an accident, only to realize that survival itself has become a condition, not a conclusion. And in the days that followed, I moved through my house like a guest in a place I had once owned, careful not to disturb arrangements that no longer felt entirely mine, because although the pressure behind my eyes had eased, its absence did not bring relief, so much as unease, the kind that follows a sudden silence after prolonged noise, when you strain to hear what might come next. Mirrors remained covered, every reflective surface dulled or turned away, and yet reflections persisted in subtler forms, in the blackened screen of my phone when it lit briefly with notifications, in the sheen of windows at night when the outside darkness turned them into imperfect glass. And each time I caught a glimpse of my outline in those surfaces, I felt a flicker of delay, A moment where I could not be sure whether I was seeing myself as I was or as something else expected me to be, and that uncertainty infected everything. The way I stood, the way I spoke, the way I occupied rooms, until even solitude felt shared. Sleep came eventually, but it was no longer restorative, filled instead with dreams that felt less like fantasies and more like rehearsals. Dreams in which I stood in familiar places, my kitchen, my bedroom, the frozen edge of the lake, watching myself from the wrong side of surfaces, understanding with calm inevitability that the difference between us was not moral or emotional, but positional, a matter of which side of the boundary had learned to move first. I began to notice then how often my thoughts arrived pre-shaped, fully articulated before I remembered forming them, how decisions presented themselves not as questions but as solutions already agreed upon, and though none of these thoughts were violent or overtly wrong, their smoothness terrified me, because they carried the same quality I had sensed beneath the ice, that eager readiness to align, to simplify, to reduce friction until transition became effortless. The true confirmation came one quiet evening as I sat alone in my living room with all the lights off, listening to the soft tick of the heater and the distant sound of traffic muffled by snow, when I realized I could sense my own reflection without seeing it, a presence just slightly offset from my awareness, like standing too close to someone in the dark and knowing exactly where they are by the heat of them. And in that moment, the memory of the lake returned with brutal clarity, not the fear, not the cracks, but the expression on the reflection's face when it pressed its hands against the ice, not rage or desperation, but certainty, the confidence of something that understood timing better than I ever could. I tried to ground myself then, to assert control through deliberate action, standing abruptly, clapping my hands, speaking nonsense aloud, and each act arrived with that same unsettling fluidity, as though my body had already been briefed on the movements, and the realization struck me like a physical blow, because I understood at last that the exchange the lake was preparing was never meant to be sudden, never meant to feel like theft. It was meant to feel like relief, like slipping out of a role you had grown tired of playing and letting someone better prepared step in. Panic rose sharply then. The first true panic I had felt since leaving the ice, and I did the one thing I had avoided since the beginning. I uncovered the mirror in my bathroom and stood before it, forcing myself to look directly at my reflection without flinching or turning away. And what stared back at me was unmistakably me. Same face, same scars, same tired eyes, but there was a stillness in it that did not belong to exhaustion, a composure that felt rehearsed. And when I raised my hand slowly, the reflection raised its own not in sync but slightly ahead, the movement anticipating mine by a fraction of a second so small it might have been missed by anyone not primed to notice it. And in that infinitesimal lead I saw the end of the process laid bare, because it meant the surface had already given way in the most important sense, that the thing beneath no longer needed to push, it only needed to step first. I staggered back from the mirror, heart racing, and covered it again. But the image lingered behind my eyes, not as fear, but as temptation. The promise of ease, of alignment, of a life lived without the constant drag of hesitation. And I understood then why so many stories end abruptly, why so few people ever describe what happens after the boundary weakens. Because the horror is not in the breaking, but in the choice it offers, the quiet suggestion that surrender is not the same as defeat. Days later, driving past the lake without intending to, I felt a sudden pull, a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with proximity. And I realized with a cold, sinking calm that the lake was no longer necessary as a place, that the surface it had taught my reflection to breach was not frozen water, but the thin, reflective membrane of awareness itself, present wherever I was willing to look at myself too closely. I still resist when I can, cultivating awkwardness, embracing hesitation, forcing myself to act out of sequence just to prove I still can. But the truth I carry with me now is heavier than fear, heavier than denial, because I know what waits beneath every polished surface, beneath every still moment when thought and action align too neatly. And I know that one day, perhaps when I'm tired or distracted or simply willing to be done with the effort of staying separate, I will look into a reflection and feel no delay at all. And when that happens, there will be no cracking sound, No dramatic breaking of ice or glass. Only the quiet, irreversible sensation of stepping aside as something perfectly familiar, perfectly prepared, rises to take my place, leaving the surface smooth and intact behind it, and the world will never know the difference. The night has grown quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that means safety, but the kind that settles in after something has finished listening. If you're still awake, still breathing slowly in the dark, take a moment before you move. Notice the room around you, the walls, the glass, the places where light hesitates and shadows hold their shape a little too well. Horror doesn't always announce itself with noise or violence. Sometimes it arrives as a pattern, a delay, a reflection that learns faster than you expect. These stories weren't meant to make you scream. They were meant to make you pause, to make you wonder why the radio crackles at a certain hour, why footsteps feel heavier when you're alone, why something familiar can become unbearable once you notice it watching back. If you're listening to this as you drift towards sleep, let the stories loosen their grip. You don't need to solve them. You don't need answers. Some things are better left unfinished, because completion is often what they're waiting for. Thank you for keeping me company in the dark tonight. Thank you for listening slowly. This has been Dread Shadow, where the silence remembers you, and the night is never truly empty. Sleep well, and if something wakes you at 4 in the morning, don't rush to check.